Shadow before Rome. Long before Rome's legions stamped their order across Italy, a different people shaped the peninsula's destiny. They were the Etruscans, a civilization suspended between legend and archaeology, rising in northern and central Italy around 800 BCE. Their story is not carved into neat chronicles like the Greeks, nor celebrated endlessly like Rome. It is half lost, half intentionally erased. What little survives comes to us in whispers, in shards of pottery, in the stone bones of their cities, and in the uneasy reflections preserved by those who conquered them. To speak of the Etruscans, then, is to wander in a twilight landscape, one where shadows flicker against the firelight of Roman myth. The great Greek historian Herodotus claimed that the Etruscans were migrants from Lydia in Anatolia, fleeing famine to establish themselves across the Tyrrhenian coast. Others, like Dionysius of Halicarnassus, rejected this, insisting they were autochthonous, born of the Italian soil itself, so ancient that even stories could not grasp their beginnings. Strangely, modern genetic studies too fail to answer decisively. Some point eastward toward Asia Minor, others northward to Alpine routes, and still others argue they were simply a distinct Italic culture. Scholars still debate whether we will ever pin down an origin, or if the Etruscans remain destined to exist as a riddle with no final solution. But what cannot be debated is their flair for leaving permanent marks. Standing on the edges of modern Tuscany, whose very name preserves theirs, we can still see remnants of their stone walls, enormous tumuli tombs, and hints of their ceremonies. Imagine for a moment the Roman Republic on the rise, a bustling upstart, clashing with neighbouring tribes. Now consider that Rome's first real kings, ambitious monarchs who layered grandeur atop its mud-brick beginnings, were them's elves Etruscan. It was they who laid out the first forums, drained the marshes that became the Circus Maximus, and set in motion the heavy machinery of ritual that Rome would call its own. Rome's triumphs, though retold as a self-born miracle, sprouted in Etruscan soil. Even their enemies admitted the Etruscans flourished. Around the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, their power stretched across Tuscany to the Campanian plains in the south, and even into the Po Valley in the north. They prospered on trade, iron and copper flowing from Elba's mines, serving both as currency and weapons. Greek merchants docked in their ports, Phoenician goods slipped through their hands, and in their great banquet halls wine was poured from imported amphorae into finely painted cups. Quirky stories reached us too. Romans later accused them of cruelty, saying they delighted in elaborate rituals of blood, the very beginnings of what would become gladiatorial contests. Yet, to Etruscans, these acts were sacred exchanges between life and death, not mere sport. In their worldview, few borders stayed solid. Ritual seeped into politics, art blurred into religion, and the afterlife mirrored the world of the living. One might wonder why, if the Etruscans had achieved so much, their memory lies in fragments today. The answer is not simply time's attrition, but Rome's deliberate rewriting. As Rome converted from monarchy to republic, it erased reminders of Etruscan dominion. Etruscan kings became villains of tyranny, symbols of oppression. Their language was neglected, their archives lost, their temples absorbed into Roman frameworks. Yet beneath the city of Rome today, archaeologists still uncover Etruscan inscriptions staring back at us, stubborn echoes of an identity carefully muted. At dusk, when the ruins of Tarquinia darken into the earth, it feels as though the civilization itself waits, neither alive nor gone, a ghost watching the empire that consumed it. This is where our journey begins, not with the certainties of empire, but with the deep shadows before empire, where the Etruscans shaped Italy and then slipped, half-hidden, into its soil. Veils of origins. The question of where the Etruscans came from has haunted scholars for over 2 millennia. Even in antiquity, their origins were already a topic of fascination and dispute, as though the people themselves had emerged from the earth without preamble. Herodotus imagined them as wanderers, driven westward from Lydia, across the wine-dark seas, carrying with them their gods, their language, and their uncanny customs. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing centuries later in Rome, dismissed this, instead painting them as a people sprung directly from Italian soil, as eternal as the oak forests of Tuscany. Between these two voices, Anatolian exiles or native-born Italians, the mystery remains suspended, unresolved. Scholars still debate whether either tradition holds weight, or if the truth is buried in an even earlier chapter, unreachable to us. Archaeology complicates rather than clarifies the story. Excavations point to the Villanovan culture of the early Iron Age, around 900 BCE, with its hut-shaped urns and cremation burials as a possible forerunner of the Etruscans. But that cultural thread may either demonstrate continuity or reveal a population embedded among waves of newcomers. Pottery shards, burial gifts, and iron objects tell us the Villanovans were already tied into the greater Mediterranean network, trading and borrowing ideas. Yet, when the Etruscans bloom into history 2 centuries later, their sophistication appears almost sudden. Grand temples replace modest huts, refined bronze work eclipses simple tools, and their art radiates a foreign vitality that seems to come from beyond Italy's borders. Did they rise from within, or were they transformed by strangers from across the sea? The debate runs even deeper under the lens of modern science. Genetic research into ancient Etruscan remains has yielded tantalizing but inconclusive results. Some Sting suggests affinities with Anatolian populations, echoing Herodotus's migration tale. Other studies tie them closely to neighbouring Italic groups, supporting Dionysius's argument for native roots. And more recently, mitochondrial DNA comparisons suggest a blending of both narratives, a people both local and influenced by migrations from the wider Mediterranean. The irony is striking. The more advanced our methods grow, the more the Etruscan identity seems deliberately enigmatic, as though they left no single answer, only contradictions. One quirky survival of their self-conception lies in the tradition of calling themselves Rasenna, or Rasna. The Greeks gave them the name Tyrannoi, which lingers in the Tyrrhenian Sea today, while the Romans Latinized it into Etrusci, the Etruscans. Yet we do not know precisely what Rasenna meant to them, only that it marked a sense of belonging we can glimpse, but not fully enter. Like their language, it lingers just out of reach, resisting translation, echoing a cultural self-image Rome actively sought to unwrite. Imagine, then, how this question of origin would have felt to the Etruscans themselves. Did they understand their land as a gift of continuity, every hill and vineyard cultivated by forebears who had always been rooted there? Or did they carry with them a myth of an eastern home, a memory of departure, oceans crossed, and a second birth in a strange land? We may never know what story they told their children as the sun set over the Tyrrhenian waves. What we can say is that by the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, however they arrived, they came to dominate central Italy with startling vigour. Their origins, whether foreign or native, matter less in the face of what they achieved. Cities rich with bronze, tumuli sprawling over hillsides, and rituals that so gripped the Romans that centuries later, they still traced their religious practices back to Etruscan teachers. And in this, another enigma lingers, whether Rome truly inherited tradition, or whether it reshaped the memory of its teachers to suit its own story. The Etruscans remain elusive, their beginnings hidden beneath the veils of speculation, lying somewhere between the myth of migration and the silence of the soil. Hidden tongue. Of all the mysteries surrounding the Etruscans, none feels more tantalizing than their language. We can hear its echoes, see its letters carved in stone, even recite fragments aloud, but meaning evaporates like smoke. The Etruscan script, written from right to left and adapted from the Greek alphabet, appears deceptively familiar. To an untrained eye, it almost looks like Latin or archaic Greek, its letters forming neat lines across bronze and terracotta. But familiarity is an illusion. The words rarely yield sense, the structure resists comparison, and the language stands alone, taut and inscrutable, an island in the middle of Indo-European seas. Scholars today can read the sounds of Etruscan with confidence. We can pronounce names, list titles, and even recognize formulaic phrases. But comprehension lies only in fragments. Most surviving texts are short, often funerary or dedicatory, names of the deceased, words for son or daughter, invocations to gods, or gifts laid down in sacred contexts. The longer inscriptions, like those stitched into linen wrappings of Egyptian mummies, where recycled Etruscan texts have been found, remain frustratingly opaque. Imagine opening an old book with chapter headings recognizable, yet the sentences between them dissolve into riddles. That is what scholars face, a readable yet untranslatable world. Scholars still debate whether Etruscan is a linguistic isolate or part of a larger lost family of Mediterranean tongues now vanished without descendants. One extraordinary artifact brings this obscurity into relief: the Liber Linteus, discovered in 19th century Croatia. The object had travelled a strange route, an Egyptian mummy wrapped not in hieroglyphic cloth, but in repurposed Etruscan linen covered in neat columns of text. Of the approximately 1,200 words that survive on this mummy wrapping, scholars have managed to identify only a handful with certainty, piecing together that the text likely describes ritual or calendar events. The rest remains a closed door, offering tantalizing glimpses but refusing to open wider. Quirky survival stories like this highlight how precarious our access to Etruscan identity really is. Their greatest library, if they ever kept one, has vanished. For the Romans, the situation was different. They absorbed many Etruscan words and concepts, particularly in the language of religion and ritual. The word persona, meaning mask, seems to trace directly back to Etruscan, as does the name of certain divinities. Roman augurs studied under Etruscan haruspices, learning their vocabulary for the heavens and the underworld. Yet the Romans themselves often admitted they could not fully understand the sacred texts they inherited. They passed along rituals without fully grasping the language that birthed them, a half-remembered tradition that retained power but shed its clarity. There is also the matter of Etruscan names. Regal and resonant names like Lars Porsena, an Etruscan king remembered in later Roman tales, survive with their texture intact, even if their meaning does not. His name appears on inscriptions mirroring the very words Roman children once shouted in schoolyard chants and poets later immortalized. Here again, the Etruscans remain present yet distant, their voices echoing in Roman pens but fading when we chase them too far. The uniqueness of their language underscores just how different the Etruscans were from their neighbours. They stood apart not only politically and culturally, but also linguistically, and this difference contributed to their aura of mystery even in antiquity. To the Romans and Greeks, they were both familiar trading partners and unfathomable others. Unlike conquering Gauls or rival Carthaginians, the Etruscans seemed inscrutable, a people whose words were spoken in shadows. And so we are left today with this tantalizing paradox, a language visible but unreadable, legible but mute. It may be that without a bilingual Rosetta Stone, it will remain locked forever. Or perhaps one day a forgotten inscription will emerge from the soil to break the silence at last. Until then, the Etruscans speak to us only in whispers we can hear but not understand, an impenetrable voice from the deep twilight of history, cities of stone As the Etruscans blossomed into power, their cities became more than settlements. They were statements of permanence. Rising across the rugged landscapes of central Italy, they built Veii, Tarquinia, Cerveteri, Volterra, and Clusium, fortified city-states, each with its own rulers, priests, and artisans. Unlike the mud and thatch villages of early Latium, these were cities of stone and timber built on hilltops and ridges, commanding sweeping views across valleys and rivers. Stand today atop the remnants of Volterra's walls, and you feel something of the pride that once radiated from a people determined not just to exist, but to endure. Their cities were the bones of their civilization, each one an island of wealth and ritual, bound to its neighbours in a confederation, yet always stubbornly independent. It was here, within high walls and carefully planned streets, that Etruscan life unfolded. Archaeologists marvel at their ingenuity, drainage systems carved to channel stormwater, defensive ramparts of Cyclopean masonry, even evidence of proto-urban planning centuries before Rome's engineers made their mark. Veii, just 12 miles from Rome, rivaled Athens in size at its peak. Its walls stretched nearly 6 miles, enclosing grand houses, sanctuaries, and workshops. No wonder the Romans later launched a desperate decade-long siege to bring the city to its knees. To measure the Etruscans, we need to see them through these immense urban achievements, not as a scattered tribe, but as a chain of powerful republics and monarchies whose stonework defied conquest for generations. And woven into these stones was a character of spirituality. Temples loomed on podiums, their bright terracotta decorations gleaming under the Italian sun. Unlike the marble-smooth geometries of the Greeks, Etruscan temples were alive with colour and motion, adorned with gabled figures of gods, horses, and warriors. The famous Apollo of Veii, striding from the roofline of the Portinaccio temple, still radiates energy today, with his archaic smile and lifelike pose. This was not just architecture as structure, it was storytelling in baked clay, broadcasting divine presence directly into bustling public squares. Scholars still debate whether these temples were intended as permanent houses of gods or theatrical stages for ritual, since many were constructed in perishable wood alongside their stone podiums. Yet even in their ruins, the sense of vibrancy lingers. Within the walls, Etruscan craftsmen reached extraordinary heights in working with bronze and iron. Their forges turned out weapons, statues, and everyday tools of remarkable skill. Armour, embossed with mythological scenes, gleamed in both war and ceremony. Bronze mirrors, finely engraved, often bore inscriptions of names now unreadable, like personal talismans bridging reflection, ritual, and identity. Quirky survivals even suggest that Etruscan mirrors weren't merely cosmetic, they were divinatory, tools for glimpsing shadows of fate. An everyday object became an agent of prophecy, a window between worlds. But as strong as each city was, unity did not come easily. The Etruscans organised into a loose confederation of 12 cities, the Dodecapolis, bound by shared rituals rather than centralised authority. Each spring, envoys gathered at the Fanum Voltumnae, a sacred meeting place, the Shrine of Voltumna. Here they debated alliances, elected leaders for joint campaigns, and held sacred festivals. Yet independence remained the rule. When threatened by Greeks from the south or Gauls from the north, neighbouring Etruscan cities often hesitated to act in concert. This fractured loyalty left them vulnerable, even as their cities dazzled with prosperity. Walking today through the necropolises of Cerveteri or Tarquinia, where streets of tombs mimic the blocks of a living city, one cannot help but feel that the Etruscans understood urban identity as eternal. They carved for the dead the same domestic structures they cherished in life: pillared halls, painted chambers, dining couches, all solidified in stone and earth. Cities of the living and cities of the dead mirrored one another. Thus, their cities of stone were not just defensive bulwarks, but reflections of a worldview rooted in permanence, ritual, and continuity. Rome would one day rise by copying their foundations, but the outlines of the Etruscan plan remain etched into the Italian landscape, speaking silently of a civilization that placed its confidence in walls, temples, and the unyielding endurance of stone, tombs of the living. If the cities of the Etruscans reveal their mastery of civic life, their tombs expose the heart of their beliefs. For in their burial grounds, the line between life and death was blurred until it nearly disappeared. The necropolises of Tarquinia, Cerveteri, and Vulci were not merely cemeteries. They were entire shadow cities, laid out with streets, chambers, courtyards, and avenues. Here, the dead resided in subterranean homes carved into tufa, surrounded by painted walls and grave goods, as though they continued to live below while the living dwelled above. To the Etruscans, death was not a sharp rupture. It was a continuation, a passage into a mirrored world where family, feasts, and song carried on eternally. Some of these tombs are among the most haunting artistic legacies of the ancient world. The tomb of the leopards at Tarquinia, named for the pair of painted big cats prancing above a banqueting scene, captures a vision of perpetual festivity. Men and women recline together on couches, raising cups of wine, encircled by musicians and dancers. Their gestures are lively, their expressions brimming with vitality. To step into this tomb is to feel less like entering a chamber of the dead and more like crashing a party, frozen in time. Scholars still debate whether these paintings represented literal beliefs about an eternal afterlife or symbolic celebrations of a life well lived. Either way, they challenge our expectations of ancient burial as solemn and silent. The Tomb of the Bulls offers another striking example, decorated with mythological scenes adapted from Greek traditions but distinctly reinterpreted. The slaying of Trojan hero Troilus and other symbolic images fill the walls, suggesting a cosmology where myth and destiny intertwined. In Cerveteri, enormous tumuli, earthen mounds containing multi-room chambers, mimic the layouts of real houses, complete with carved beds, chairs, even beams in the stone ceiling. The message is unmistakable. The dead would continue inhabiting familiar spaces, as though death was simply a relocation to another district of the city. Quirky customs emerge too. Archaeologists have found miniature chariots, bronze utensils, and even board games sealed in tombs, suggesting that the pleasures of life were meant to extend into death. In Tarquinia's Tomb of the Augurs, two mourners appear to play a game that involves balancing themselves against a post while masked figures look on. Was this a ritual performance, a funerary sport, or an echo of games played at living banquets? We cannot know for certain. Scholars still debate whether such activities were intended to entertain the spirit or to reenact cosmic dramas of renewal. What is clear, however, is that the Etruscans were less terrified of death than many of their contemporaries. Their tombs are vivid with joy, music, and movement. Dancers leap, lyres are strummed, and vines twine across painted walls to remind visitors, be they human or divine, that life was abundant. Unlike Greek funerary art, which often dwelled in stoic lament, or early Roman practices that veiled death in stern ritual, the Etruscans celebrated vitality on the very threshold of eternity. Yet in later centuries, their images grew darker. The Tomb of the Blue Demons at Tarquinia presents winged, terrifying beings guiding souls toward the afterlife. Here we sense a different Etruscan philosophy emerging, one more burdened by dread of what lay beyond. Perhaps as their world faced the pressure of Roman expansion and internal decline, the certainty of joy gave way to anxiety. Death, once a feast, became a perilous journey. The walls themselves tell us that their vision of the afterlife was dynamic, evolving over centuries, marked by both comfort and fear. To descend into these tombs today is to enter what feels less like an archaeological site and more like a dialogue with ghosts. The colours, astonishingly well preserved after 2,500 years, seem designed to resist erasure, as though the Etruscans anticipated their civilization fading, but trusted their art to endure. Beneath the hills of Tarquinia and Cerveteri, their voices remain alive in pigment and stone, speaking of a culture where death was not an end, but another chapter in the ongoing banquet of existence. The Etruscan smile. If the tombs reveal how the Etruscans imagined eternity, their sculptures and artifacts reveal how they imagined themselves. One motif recurs across their artistic world, a serene and slightly enigmatic expression known today as the Etruscan smile. It appears on sarcophagi, terracotta figures, bronze statues, and painted faces, a knowing curve of the lips that seems to bridge the worlds of life and death. More than mere artistic convention, the smile suggests something deeper, a worldview revolving around vitality, resilience, and continuity. Looking into those faces, one senses that the Etruscans approached the human condition not with solemn gravity, but with a kind of fearless confidence, as though aware that even in death, a spark of life remained. The most famous example is the sarcophagus of the spouses from Cerveteri, dating to the late 6th century BCE. Carved from terracotta, it shows a husband and wife reclining together on a banquet couch, their arms raised as though in mid-conversation or offering a toast. The intimacy of the pose is startling for the ancient world, the couple depicted as equals, united in eternity in both gesture and gaze. Their faces, though stylized, radiate a gentle contentment. For the Greeks, art largely commemorated the heroic and the ideal. For the Romans, it would come to embody stern realism and political gravitas. But the Etruscans seem to have chosen another path, to emphasize warmth, hospitality, and companionship as eternal values. Scholars still debate whether this reflected a broader social equality or simply artistic emphasis, but no other ancient culture enshrined this domestic intimacy so clearly in funerary art, and it is not only in sarcophagi. Excavated bronzes, such as the celebrated Chimera of Arezzo, illustrate the other side of their artistry, a fierce vitality infused into mythic forms. This snarling hybrid of lion, goat, and serpent seems caught mid-roar, muscles taut, flames once imagined to erupt from its mouth. Created around the 5th century BCE, it was likely a votive offering, left in a temple, another reminder of how art bridged ritual with representation. Whichever hands shaped it knew how to channel terror into beauty, a paradox that carries across much of Etruscan craftsmanship. Terracotta, more than marble, was their chosen medium. Temples across Etruria were adorned with brightly painted statues, fashioned from clay, fired with surprising precision. The Apollo of Veii, poised with striding motion atop a temple roof, is not just a god cast in solid form. It exudes animation, vigour, even conversation, as if ready to step down among worshippers. A quirky fact emerges here. Unlike the Greeks, who reserved terracotta for minor ornaments, the Etruscans elevated it to monumental heights, trusting it to immortalize their gods and their dead. Their bronze working was equally masterful. Mirrors engraved with mythological images often included inscriptions too faint for us now to truly understand. But these objects remind us that art was not kept separate from daily utility. Imagine combing your hair before a polished bronze surface, your reflection watched over by inscribed names and gods. Perhaps those mirrors were tokens of beauty, perhaps of prophecy. Scholars still debate whether such artifacts functioned purely as domestic necessities or as conduits of divine communication. The Etruscan aesthetic, then, was not one of cold detachment but of liveliness. Smiles, gestures, and motion abound in their work. Even funerary urns, shaped like miniature houses, brim with detail. They remind us of the domestic mirroring we saw earlier in the tombs. Art was less about abstract ideals and more about real, felt continuities. Rome inherited this artistry unevenly. The realism that would define Roman portraiture, every wrinkle, every scar, probably owed its start to the Etruscan willingness to depict vitality. Yet Rome stripped away the warmth of the smile, focusing instead on austere dignity. The Etruscan vitality became a whisper beneath Rome's self-fashioned gravitas. And so in museum galleries today, when we turn to a terracotta sarcophagus or a free-striding statue, we meet those smiles once more. Neither mocking nor overly serene, they are halfway to the grave and halfway into life. A reminder that this lost people embraced both conditions in harmony. The Etruscan smile is not simply an artistic trope. It is a philosophy made visible. Rules of kings. Rome, that great empire to be, did not always belong to itself. In its earliest days it was shaped, ruled, and in some ways conquered from within by the Etruscans. Long before the Republic, kings sat on Rome's throne, and some of the most powerful wore Etruscan crowns. History remembers them through the dynastic thread of the Tarquins, a family whose ambition stretched across both cultures, fusing the vitality of Etruria with the growing energies of the Latin world. It is here, with monarchy and its dramatic fall, that the paths of Rome and Etruria entwine most tightly. The Etruscan dynasty in Rome likely began with Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, often called Tarquin the Elder. Arriving, according to later legend, as a migrant of Etruscan or possibly mixed Greek-Etruscan background, he rose swiftly in the city, not yet fully formed. Roman tradition tells us he became Rome's fifth king around 616 BCE. Under his reign, great works were set in motion. The Circus Maximus, where chariots would roar for centuries, the Cloaca Maxima, that massive drain which turned swamp into habitable ground, and the building of the first great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. These were projects beyond the resources of early Rome. They were dreams in stone, shaped by Etruscan engineering, vision, and labour. His successors only tightened the Etruscan grip. Servius Tullius, who ruled in the mid-6th century BCE, reorganized Rome into new tribes, instituted the first census, and reformed the army. Legends declare that a ring of fire burned around his head as a child, marking him chosen by the gods. Whether fact or fiction, it reflects how Romans saw him as both divinely favoured and profoundly transformative. Even the very grid of Roman civic life, class divisions based on wealth, the system of assembly by centuries, bore his mark. And then came Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, the seventh and last king, remembered as both magnificent and tyrannical. Ancient accounts describe his reign as one of dominance. He surrounded Rome with walls, expanded its territory, and completed monumental projects. Yet his cruelty and arrogance bred resentment. Tradition recounts his overthrow in 509 BCE, sparked by the outrage of Lucretia's violation and suicide, a narrative Rome would retell endlessly as its origin story for the Republic. Whether the details are embellished or entirely mythologized, the outcome is certain. Rome cast out its last Etruscan king and vowed never again to be ruled by a monarch. Quirky legends still linger around this period. One tells of Lars Porsena, an Etruscan king of Clusium, who marched to restore Tarquin to power. His siege of Rome became legendary, not because of his victory, he did not succeed, but because of Roman stories of defiance, like Horatius Cocles holding the wooden bridge against an army, or the maiden Cloelia escaping captivity by swimming across the Tiber. These tales lift the event into myth, casting Romans as noble defenders and Etruscans as shadows of oppressive kingship. Scholars still debate whether these stories conceal a different truth. Perhaps Porsena actually conquered Rome, but in later memory, the Romans reshaped his victory into their own triumph. Once again, Rome rewrote the Etruscans into foils rather than partners in the city's story. The Tarquin kings demonstrate just how deeply embedded Etruscan influence was in Rome's foundations. Religious ceremony, ritual symbols of power, even the purple robe and golden crown of Roman magistrates came directly from Etruscan tradition. Yet Rome repackaged them, stripping away acknowledgement of who had taught them. In banishing the kings, Rome began banishing the memory of its Etruscan tutors, and so the rules of kingship became the rules of forgetting. The Tarquins left a legacy of engineering and governance, but also of tyranny in Roman imagination. Their reign sits at the hinge of history, the point at which Rome inherited its first greatness, yet determined to erase the hands that set it in motion. Roads, rituals, Romans. Once the Tarquin kings were gone, Rome moved quickly to redefine itself. But the fingerprints of Etruscan culture could not be so easily erased. Instead, they lingered inside Rome's most sacred structures, underneath its streets, and within the rhythms of its daily life. To look at Rome, even in its republican glory, is to see an Etruscan inheritance, often resurfacing in ritual or stone, even when Roman storytellers denied its origins. One of the most striking Etruscan legacies lies in engineering. The Cloaca Maxima, that gaping drain built under the Tarquins, became the backbone of Roman urban life, carrying water away from the lowlands and transforming swamp into habitable forum. The Etruscan gift of hydraulic engineering reached far beyond sewers. In Veii, archaeologists have found evidence of advanced aqueduct systems cut directly into stone, a precursor to Rome's later triumphs in water management. Roads, too, bore the stamp of Etruria. The Etruscans paved their city streets in carefully fitted stone long before Roman military roads marched outward across Europe. In Cerveteri, travel between urban settlements required not muddy tracks, but well-prepared roadways suitable even for chariots. Rome would famously take this technique and extend it until all roads led to Rome, but first the roads led to Veii and Tarquinia. Yet the influence was not just physical. The very rituals underpinning Roman life were Etruscan at their core. Augury, the art of reading the flight of birds, came into Rome filtered through Etruscan traditions of divination. The role of the haruspices, specialists who examined the entrails of sacrificed animals to interpret divine will, became essential to Roman decision-making. When emperors centuries later faced crises, they still summoned Etruscan-trained officials to read omens. Rome may have rejected Etruscan kings, but it never abandoned their gods' language. Symbols of political authority were equally borrowed. The curule chair, the purple-edged toga, and the golden crown, all signs of Roman magistracy, traced directly to Etruscan regalia. Even the fasces, a bundle of rods bound around an axe, carried by lictors as a mark of power, originated in Etruria. In time, these symbols would survive the Republic, pass into the Empire, and echo still deeper into modern history, long after the Etruscans themselves vanished. Scholars still debate whether the Romans imported these icons wholesale or subtly reinterpreted them, but the continuity is unmistakable. Of course, Roman storytellers twisted these inheritances to suit their founding narrative. The Etruscan throne became a symbol of tyranny. The purple robe symbolized hubris that required overthrow. Yet even as they vilified the trappings of monarchy, the Romans could not relinquish the pomp and circumstance those trappings provided. In this contradiction, we glimpse how Rome's identity was entwined with the very civilization it claimed to supersede. Some quirky details reveal how deeply the inheritances ran. Ancient sources describe elaborate religious processions with Etruscan musicians, trumpeters, and dancers making their way through Roman streets during sacred festivals. Even the sport of gladiatorial combat, as we shall see later, may have originated as an Etruscan funerary ritual. Death and spectacle, authority and ritual, engineering and urban life all entered the bloodstream of Rome by way of Etruria, and yet Rome silenced the origins. By the Augustan age, stories of Rome's divine descent from Trojan hero Aeneas had utterly overshadowed the older, messier truth that Rome's laws, roads, and temples had Etruscan scaffolding. Roman poets evoked Homeric lineage, not Etruscan kings. The civilization that had taught Rome how to build and how to worship was remade into an enemy in the shadows of memory. Here lies the paradox. Rome, the eternal city, claimed to have sprung from divine ancestry, yet stood securely only because of Etruscan roads under its feet, Etruscan drains beneath its forums, and Etruscan rituals binding its communities together. Erased from memory, but embedded in practice, the Etruscans shaped Rome more deeply than Rome ever admitted. Power of women. Among the most striking features of Etruscan society, at least to Greek and Roman eyes, was the prominence of its women. In a Mediterranean world where female voices were often confined to shadows, the women of Etruria dined in public, reclined alongside men at banquets, and even appeared in inscriptions under their own names. For outsiders accustomed to sharply drawn gender hierarchies, this was almost scandalous. Greek writers in particular sneered at what they saw as the immodesty of Etruscan customs, perplexed, or perhaps unsettled, that women could appear visibly, even vocally, in civic life. Yet what scandalized neighbors may in fact reveal one of the unique strengths of Etruscan culture. The archaeological record bears this out. In painted tombs, men and women recline together on dining couches, raising cups in mirrored gestures of equality. No other contemporary art in the Mediterranean shows this so vividly. On the sarcophagus of the spouses we encountered earlier, the female figure is not relegated to the background, but sits at the heart of the composition, as crucial to the vision of eternity as her husband. Funerary inscriptions often include both mothers' and fathers' names, a practice rare in antiquity. To be the daughter of a known woman in Etruria conferred identity just as surely as descent from the father. One quirky survival of these customs comes in Roman gossip. Writers liked to exaggerate and scandalize, portraying Etruscan women as reckless in love, even promiscuous, a libel reflecting their unease at this relative freedom. Yet what Romans scorned as vice may simply have been visibility, women moving and acting openly in a world unused to it. A woman like Tanaquil, the wife of Tarquinius Priscus, emerges in legend as a political actor in her own right. Tradition records that she interpreted omens, orchestrated her husband's rise to the Roman throne, and ensured the succession of Servius Tullius. She was not a passive royal bride, but a cunning and respected power broker in Rome's formative years. Scholars still debate whether her prominence reflects later invention by Roman chroniclers or preserves a kernel of genuine Etruscan societal reality. Evidence continues in material culture, elaborate jewellery crafted in gold granulation, intricate mirrors inscribed with women's names, and sarcophagi depicting couples as equals, even partners gazing toward eternity. These artifacts suggest not only that women participated in public feasting and religious rituals, but that their beauty, intellect, and presence were commemorated as lasting values worth preserving in art. This balance, however, did not mean Etruscan women were entirely free from limits. Society retained rigid stratification, and noble families exerted great control over alliances, marriages, and lineage. Yet, when we contrast their visibility with the silence imposed upon Greek women, the contrast is stark. The Etruscans seem to have normalized a broader public role for women, partnering in ritual, in feast, and perhaps even in governance. Rome inherited fragments of this world. Vestal virgins, with their extraordinary prestige and authority, may represent a distant echo of Etruscan respect for female religious roles. Yet, as Rome absorbed Etruria, the fuller participation of women waned. Republican Rome defined itself in contrast to the openness of its predecessors, enforcing stricter boundaries that lasted for centuries. The traces of Etruscan female power faded into curiosity or moral warning. Still, the tombs and artifacts resist erasure. In the necropolises of Tarquinia, the murals show women laughing, feasting, and dancing alongside men. On carved lids of sarcophagi, husbands and wives share eternity together. These depictions remind us that the Etruscan household, the bedrock of their society, was not conceived as patriarchal solitude, but as partnership. To walk among their ruins today is to glimpse a world in which women were not erased, but inscribed, not silent, but smiling at the banquet with cup raised high. In that sense, their legacy lingers, an anomalous heartbeat of equality, pulsing beneath the heavy patriarchies of antiquity. Music and games. If feast and ritual animated Etruscan daily life, it was music and games that gave those moments their texture. Imagine walking through an Etruscan festival, the air alive with the trill of double flutes, the steady rhythms of drums, and the melodic strumming of lyres. Dancers sway in painted frescoes, their gestures both playful and ceremonial. Musicians accompany athletes, feasts and funerals alike, their melodies blurring boundaries between sacred devotion and worldly delight. Rome would later cultivate its own musical traditions, but the seeds of spectacle and performance were sown much earlier in Etruria. Archaeology grants us glimpses. Bronze candelabra, carved plaques, and painted tomb walls reveal a society immersed in sound. In Tarquinia's painted tombs, flute players and kithara strummers stand beside dining couches, ensuring that eternal banquets unfolded with accompaniment. In the tomb of the leopards, young men recline, cups raised, entertained by lyres and pipes, a reminder that in the Etruscan worldview, joy and art did not die with the body. Scholars still debate whether such music was purely recreational or infused with mystical significance, perhaps echoing the harmonies of the cosmos, aligning the living with divine patterns. Games, too, were integral, from athletic contests to board games buried alongside the dead. Excavations have uncovered dice, playing pieces, and game boards interred in tombs, as though departed souls were expected to while away eternity as they had their mortal evenings. More strikingly, athletic events seem to have linked competition with religious ritual. Tomb paintings show young men wrestling, racing, and performing feats of agility under the gaze of gods and mourners alike. For the Etruscans, physical play was never mere pastime. It was offering, spectacle, and sacred renewal. Perhaps most famously, it waited as from the Etruscans that gladiatorial combat seems to have originated. Roman writers later described such contests as grim spectacles of blood and honour, but in Etruria they may have served funerary purposes. At the death of a noble, warriors fought in ritual combat beside the grave, their sacrifice intended to appease spirits or to gift vitality to the soul of the deceased. To modern ears, this sounds chilling, but in Etruscan eyes, it was a natural extension of their blurred boundary between life and death. Scholars still debate whether these combats were truly deadly or more symbolic struggles, but the eventual Roman transformation into staged mass entertainment certainly traces back here. Other quirks surround their athletic culture. Frescoes depict men leaping over tethered beasts, perhaps bulls, in athletic displays reminiscent of Minoan Crete. Were these foreign borrowings, or uniquely Etruscan inventions? The resemblance is tantalizing, and yet we cannot be certain whether the Etruscans consciously echoed older Mediterranean traditions or independently imagined these dramatic feats. Musical instruments themselves offer clues. Etruscan bronze horns called lituus later entered Roman ceremony, their curling shapes producing eerie tones suited for summoning divine presence. Even Rome's military trumpets may have inherited something of their Etruscan forebears. Thus, the marching rhythm of imperial legions might, in some sense, echo the festival soundscapes of Tarquinia and Veii. For the Greeks, accustomed to strict separations between public games, private symposia, and sacred rites, the mingling of all three in Etruria appeared unsettling. For the Romans, who later codified gladiatorial games as tools of power, the Etruscan example provided foundation. But for the Etruscans themselves, music and games formed a seamless continuum saturating every threshold, banquet, tomb, arena, temple. Sound, movement, and contest bound their communities together, connecting them with divine forces. When we consider that the Romans inherited both their most solemn temple processions and their bloodiest arena spectacles from Etruria, it becomes clear. The roots of Roman grandeur and cruelty alike threaded through the same cultural soil. The Etruscans gave rhythm to ritual and spectacle to sorrow, and in so doing, they composed a cultural score Rome would never stop playing, even as it forgot the names of those first musicians, gods between worlds. To step into the religious imagination of the Etruscans is to enter a cosmos charged with peril and guidance, omens and bargains. Their gods were neither distant nor purely benevolent. They were immanent, entwined in every action, ready to reveal approval or wrath through signs in the sky, cracks in lightning, or the entrails of sacrificed animals. Unlike the Greeks, whose myths clothed their deities in epic drama, or the Romans, who institutionalized their gods as pillars of civic statecraft, the Etruscans approached religion as a system of constant negotiation. Life was lived in dialogue with powers both merciful and terrifying, a permanent consultation between the living and the beyond. The pantheon itself remains partially obscured, though major deities are known. Tinia, often equated with Zeus or Jupiter, served as the thunder-wielding sky god. Uni, akin to Hera or Juno, presided as a grand goddess, while Minerva, later Roman Minerva, embodied wisdom, music, and war. Whole families of deities filled the Etruscan cosmos, including both luminous gods and dark underworld figures, many without direct Greek or Roman parallels. Divine triads governed worlds above, below, and in between. Yet it was not only the names that set them apart, it was the tone of their worship. Where Greek religion often celebrated narrative myth, the Etruscans ritualized interpretation. Their disciplina Etrusca, the sacred knowledge, was a framework for reading divine will in every natural occurrence. They believed no lightning strike, no flight of a bird, no blemish on an animal's liver was accidental. The universe was a text, constantly sending messages. Priests, trained across generations, acted as interpreters between humans and gods. Scholars still debate whether this constituted genuine theology or a pragmatic science of signs, but for the Etruscans, it was all of life. Quirky traces of this devotion remain in objects like bronze figurines of winged demons found in funerary art. These beings, fierce and protective, guided souls into the afterlife, but could also torment. One striking image painted in Tarquinia shows terrifying underworld servants, armed with hammers and snakes, escorting the deceased. The Etruscan vision of life after death was therefore not one of blissful rest, but of vigilance. The dead entered a realm filled with gods who might favour or punish, depending upon whether rituals had been performed correctly in life. Thunder, above all, was the voice of Tinia. Etruscan priests believed the sky was divided into 16 regions, each ruled by divine forces. A flash in one section bore a radically different meaning than one in another. Training to decipher these messages was rigorous, sometimes lifelong, and Rome itself later imported these priests to consult omens for military campaigns and state decisions. A senate might debate law, but the gods, in the form of Etruscan divination, had the last voice. Religion was also embedded in their social fabric. During festivals, worship spilled out into music, athletic games, and feasting. Tomb frescoes depict such rituals not as detached from daily joy, but fused with it, suggesting that encountering the divine was never separate from community life. A funeral could be both sacred and celebratory, a union of mourning and thanksgiving, and yet the fearsome side never retreated. In their vision, no act was free of consequence. The gods were not distant watchers, they were auditors. Every decision, personal or civic, risked provoking divine response. This cosmic vigilance may explain why Rome, fascinated and uneasy, absorbed so many Etruscan rituals. They were both alluring tools of order and chilling reminders that no human action was ever entirely one's own. What emerges then is a religious system suspended between reassurance and dread, feast and omen, life and death. The Etruscans lived in constant negotiation with invisible forces, a dialogue scrawled across tomb paintings, temples, and thundercloud-filled skies. Their gods were everywhere, above ground and underground, in music and in blood sacrifice, anchoring them in a universe that never stopped speaking, omens in the sky. Among all the legacies the Etruscans left behind, none fascinated their neighbours more than their ability to read the will of the gods. To the Greeks, this was curious. To the Romans, it was indispensable. Etruscan diviners stood poised between heaven and earth, turning natural phenomena into messages of fate. Lightning strikes, bird calls, animal entrails. These were the Etruscans' scriptures, a divine language written not on scrolls, but across the very fabric of nature. Rome, in absorbing their practices, ensured that Etruscan methods of divination would echo through centuries of empire. The most elaborate technique was haruspicy, the reading of animal entrails, particularly the liver. When a sheep or ox was sacrificed, priests studied the organ's markings, lobes, veins, irregularities, as if scanning a cosmic map. The gods encoded their judgment there, and the haruspex acted as interpreter. One extraordinary artifact discovered in northern Italy reveals how systematic this practice could be: the liver of Piacenza, a bronze model of a sheep's liver inscribed and divided into 40 sections, each linked to a deity. Held today as one of the strangest relics of antiquity, it demonstrates both the meticulous nature of Etruscan ritual and its daunting complexity. Scholars still debate whether priests memorized divine correspondences or guided their interpretations through improvisation. Either way, to the Etruscans, the gods left no silence. Every blemish was a message. Augury, the reading of bird flights, provided another route to understanding divine will. Etruscan augurs carried crooked staffs called lituus, using them to mark divisions of the heavens. Within those quadrants, the flight of ravens, eagles, or vultures conveyed approval or warning. Rome absorbed this practice wholesale, installing augurs into its own civic framework. Decisions of war, our law and state could not proceed unless flights of birds were favourable. Thus, even long after the Etruscans themselves had been subdued, their voice still dictated whether Rome marched to battle. Quirky interpretations extended even further. Etruscan priests specialized in brontoscopy, the reading of thunder and lightning. They believed the sky was divided into 16 regions, each governed by divine forces. A bolt flashing from the northwest bore starkly different meaning from one that split the sky in the east. More strangely, not all lightning was destructive. Some was even deemed positive, a fiery punctuation mark approving human plans. Romans inherited these libraries of thunder, but tended to condense them into simplified omens. The Etruscan cosmos, far richer, bristled with detail and demanded ceaseless attentiveness. For the Etruscans, this vigilance was not obsessive eccentricity, it was survival. They envisioned the world as permeated by divine forces, unfathomable yet readable if one knew how. To ignore signs was arrogance. Every ruler, every general, every family head was bound to consult the patterns of heaven and earth. Unlike Greek religion, which leaned upon narrative myth, or Roman tradition, which codified dogma into civic ritual, Etruscan faith centered upon interpretation, a continual reading of a restless universe. Even in death, we find testimony to this system. Paintings in Tarquinian tombs depict augurs observing games and rituals, staffs in hand, as though confirming divine judgment upon the deceased. The priests accompanied souls as guardians of cosmic order, affirming that the divine language extended beyond the grave, and yet, despite its sophistication, the system feels fragile. With language lost and written texts vanished, much of the disciplina Etrusca has evaporated. What reach us are echoes, bronze livers, crooked staffs, and Roman retellings. Scholars still debate whether Rome's version preserved authentic practices or refashioned them into convenient political instruments. The truth is likely a blend, faithful inheritances mixed with pragmatic adaptation. What lingers, however, is the Etruscans' extraordinary claim that the universe itself never ceased speaking, and that one could, with discipline and reverence, listen. Every flash, every bird, every curve of a sheep's liver was a word in the gods' sprawling language. For the Etruscans, the heavens were not silent, they were alive with omens. Ships of the Tyrrhenian, the Etruscans were not only builders of cities and masters of ritual, they were sailors too, controlling the seas that bore their name. To the Greeks they were the Tyrrhenoi, and the body of water lapping against western Italy came to be called the Tyrrhenian Sea. From the 8th through the 6th centuries BCE, their ships plied these waters, carrying metals, wine, ceramics, and people in a web of trade and sometimes piracy. In this maritime world, the Etruscans became both feared and admired, a seafaring power that stood alongside the Greeks and Phoenicians. Etruscan ships were well suited to Mediterranean conditions, sturdy hulls, broad enough for trade cargo, yet manoeuvrable enough for war. Archaeological finds of anchors, depictions of ships on engraved mirrors, and scattered wrecks provide a glimpse into their designs. Like their contemporaries, they harnessed both sail and oar, closing coastal distances with efficiency. For foreign merchants arriving in Etruscan harbours at Populonia, Volci, or Caere, these ships represented both opportunity and risk. For while the Etruscans thrived in trade, they also gained a reputation for piracy, seizing vessels off their coasts or extracting tribute from those who dared their waters. Scholars still debate whether these reports from Greek sources reflect fact or propaganda fueled by rivalry. Quirky stories underline their notoriety. The Greek myth of the Tyrrhenian pirates, sailors who kidnapped the god Dionysus, only to be turned into dolphins when he revealed himself, may in fact be a cultural memory of Etruscan seafarers. To the Greeks, the sight of strange sails on the horizon may have seemed as menacing as divine punishment itself. Whether the Etruscans truly engaged in widespread piracy or were simply convenient scapegoats for naval competition, their maritime presence was indelible enough to leave mythological traces. Yet trade, not plunder, seems to have been their true wealth. From the metal-rich mines of Elba and Populonia came iron and copper fueling workshops across the Mediterranean. Etruscan merchants exchanged these for Greek pottery, Eastern luxury goods, and exotic materials. Archaeologists have found Greek amphorae and finely painted kylixes in Etruscan tombs, suggesting how strongly these imports affirmed status in life and the afterlife alike. In turn, Etruscan goods travelled far afield. Bronze cauldrons and Bucero pottery have been unearthed in sanctuaries in Greece, attesting to a vigorous exchange. Seafaring also brought cultural cross-pollination. Myths, artistic motifs, and even ritual practices flowed along the same trade routes as wine and metal. When Greek pottery reached Etruria, craftsmen imitated and reinterpreted its designs, folding foreign myth into their own stories. Some images of Heracles, Perseus, and other heroes appear in modified forms on Etruscan mirrors and vases. This interplay reminds us that the sea was more than an economic pathway, it was a cultural bloodstream. Still, danger shadowed Etruscan supremacy on the waves. Around the 6th century BCE, they formed alliances with Carthage to hold back Greek expansion. One recorded clash is the Battle of Alalia around 540 BCE, where combined Etruscan-Carthaginian forces fought Greek colonists from Phocaea. According to later accounts, the Greeks won a Pyrrhic victory, their fleet crippled even in triumph, prompting their withdrawal from Corsica. From that point onward, the Tyrrhenian Sea was firmly in Etruscan and Carthaginian hands, though at great cost. Over time, however, this dominance waned. As Rome expanded on land, Greek naval power regained its bite, and Carthage eventually overshadowed its ally. The Etruscans, their cities fractured, could not sustain maritime supremacy on their own. What once was their proud domain became contested waters, and their ships retreated from the forefront of history. But to sail the Tyrrhenian Sea today is to feel their presence. The very name of the waters preserves their memory, a reminder that they were once feared seafarers, gods and pirates in Greek imagination, traders and navigators in truth. For a moment in history, Etruscan sails stitched together the coasts of the Mediterranean, their power as fluid and restless as the sea itself. Merchants of metal, beneath Etruria's rolling hills, in the veins of its mountains and the dark stone of its islands, lay the foundation of its wealth. Metal. More than ritual, more than ships, it was iron and copper that secured their power and made Etruscan cities indispensable players in the web of Mediterranean trade. From the rich deposits of Elba Island and the mines of Populonia, streams of raw ore flowed outward, feeding workshops at home and supplying foreign markets abroad. To understand Etruscan ascendancy, we must imagine not only music in banquets or omens in lightning, but also the glow of forges, the hammering of bronze casters, and the clang of iron tools shaping stone and soil. Evidence paints a vivid picture. Populonia, perched on the Tuscan coast, was famed in antiquity for its iron production. Hills around it were scarred with furnaces and slag heaps, so immense that even today traces of ancient smelting remain. The smoke of foundries must have risen constantly, drifting out to sea, guiding merchant ships to harbour. Bronze cauldrons, buckles, helmets, and elaborate candelabra all emerged from this metallurgical industry, traded as far east as Greece and as far north as the Alpine corridors. For their neighbours, the Etruscans were merchants of metal, unrivalled craftsmen, transforming the raw earth into economic and ritual power. Quirky finds emphasise the reach of their exports. An Etruscan-made bronze cauldron adorned with griffin heads was discovered in Olympia, deposited as a Greek votive offering to Zeus. Another surfaced in Central Europe, carried perhaps through transalpine trade routes. These objects carried not only material value but cultural prestige. To own finely worked Etruscan bronze was to possess a fragment of their artistry and their rituals, an exotic treasure from an enigmatic people. Scholars still debate whether the Etruscans controlled these expansive exchanges directly with their ships, or whether intermediaries, Greeks, Phoenicians, or Celts, helped disseminate the goods. Either possibility cements their place in Mediterranean networks. The very quality of their work set them apart. Etruscan bronze workers mastered granulation and filigree, producing delicate golden jewellery whose intricacy amazes even modern metallurgists. Helmets embossed with mythological scenes combined functionality with display. Armour not only protected but proclaimed wealth and cultural belonging. The famous chimera of Arezzo, cast in bronze, was itself a votive offering, a terrifyingly beautiful reminder that metal in Etruscan culture always possessed dual meaning, utility and spirituality, tool and talisman. Mining also reshaped their relationship with the land. Elba, source of abundant iron, became both treasure and symbol. Herodotus even remarks upon it, emphasizing the importance of its ore to Etruscan prosperity. Yet such reliance brought vulnerability. When rival powers disrupted maritime routes or seized coastal zones, the flow of their most valuable commodity faltered. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the late 4th century BCE, control of Elba slipped away under pressure from new naval rivals, weakening a once proud monopoly. Still, during their ascendancy, the Etruscans commanded respect as consummate artisans. Roman patricians later prized Etruscan-made vessels and jewellery, even as they derided the people themselves. The paradox is telling. Rome absorbed their products, their technologies, even their metallurgical expertise, but worked tirelessly to obscure the name of those who forged them. A particularly curious detail appears in funerary contexts. Among grave goods laid beside nobles are not only weapons and adornments, but full sets of smithing tools. To take such tools into death suggests that crafting itself held ritual value, almost priestly significance. Metalwork was not just industry, it was cosmic alignment, taming Earth's raw matter into sacred form. Thus, the forges of Etruria were no mere backdrop to history, they were engines of expansion and reputation. For centuries, as their ships travelled south to mingle with Carthaginians, east to exchange goods with Greeks, and north into Europe, they carried with them the weight of iron and the lustre of bronze. In the clang of every hammer upon anvil, the sound of Etruria's true power can still be heard, metal shaping not only objects, but the very destiny of a civilization. Encounters with Greece. The Etruscans did not live in isolation. Their power rose at the same moment Greek city-states spread colonies across southern Italy and Sicily, turning the Mediterranean into a checkerboard of cultures, ports, and rivalries. Inevitably, Etruria and Greece collided, not only in battle, but in art, myth, and religion. Out of these encounters came one of the richest syntheses in antiquity. Greek ideas reshaped in Etruscan clay, bronze, and belief, producing objects at once familiar and strange. Greek pottery offers the most vivid window into this exchange. Black figure and red figure vases, shipped from Athens, Corinth, and other centres, poured into Etruscan ports. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands, scattered in tombs where they accompanied the dead into eternity. Symposian vessels, craters, cups, amphorae. Each imported piece served as a sign of status, proof that the household participated in Mediterranean currents of taste and trade. But the Etruscans did not only collect, they imitated and reimagined. Their artisans produced painted pottery in Greek styles, but adjusted the imagery. Heroic myths, Heracles, Perseus, Achilles, appear with Etruscan spellings of names, sometimes in altered narratives. The Greeks may have shared their stories, but the Etruscans rewrote them, drawing these legends into their own symbolic structure. Scholars still debate whether this reflects cultural borrowing or confident reinterpretation of a shared Mediterranean language of myth. One quirky example is the Etruscan devotion to Heracles, whom they called Hercle. While the Greeks depicted him as the quintessential wandering hero, the Etruscans often portrayed him seated quietly, receiving offerings, or integrated into domestic scenes. To them, Hercule was less a restless adventurer and more a godly protector, adopted, transformed, and localized. Another Boros, the yet reimagined figure was Apollo. Etruscan terracottas like the Apollo of Veii show him striding energetically, no longer the serene Olympian, but a figure of motion and theatrical presence. The encounters were not always peaceful. The 6th century BCE saw rising hostility between Etruscans and Greek colonists in southern Italy. The Battle of Alalia, which we touched on earlier, pitted Etruscan and Carthaginian fleets against adventurous Ionian Greeks. Though accounts differ, the aftermath shifted control in favour of Etruscans, at least temporarily, securing their hold on Corsican and Tyrrhenian routes. Trade, however, continued even in rivalry, a reminder that in the ancient Mediterranean, war and commerce often ran in parallel. Art reflects this tension vividly. While Greek vase paintings often poke fun at foreigners, displaying exaggerated features or barbarian dress, Etruscan art absorbed Greek motifs with respect, but made them their own. A vase might show Perseus slaying Medusa, but the figure of Perseus appears with rounder features, an Etruscanized form accompanied by inscriptions in their own script. The adoption of Greek themes was less homage than adaptation. Religion too absorbed Greece. Tinia, Uni, and Minerva grew ever closer to Zeus, Hera, and Athena. Yet instead of vanishing, the Etruscan versions persisted in parallel, as though multiple divine traditions coexisted comfortably in the same ritual system. The Etruscans seemed untroubled by contradictions, content to weave imported beliefs into their own fabric. Rome would later inherit this adaptability wholesale, building a pantheon large enough to embrace gods from every corner of its empire. These encounters suggest the Etruscans were not simply passive recipients of Greek prestige, but active remixers, choosing what to adopt, alter, or emphasize. They borrowed images of symposium banquets, but depicted both men and women reclining together, a radical departure from Greek norms. They took Greek myths, but bent them toward their own cosmological concerns. Even in defeat, the cultural exchange did not cease. In the end, what passes to us is a vision of cultural interplay. Etruscans drinking wine from Greek cups while listening to their own musicians, Etruscan artists painting Achilles in unfamiliar style, Etruscan kings commissioning terracotta statues that looked Greek, yet moved with distinctly Etruscan vitality. They walked a fine line, neighbours, rivals, partners and interpreters of the Hellenic world. In doing so, they left behind a unique cultural voice. Greek in accent, but unmistakably their own in tone. Banquets of the dead. Nowhere is Etruscan distinctiveness more palpable than in their banquets, both of the living and of the dead. To recline at table was not simply to eat, it was to affirm status, community, and communion with the gods. And in Etruria, this ritual extended beyond life itself. The banquets depicted in tombs, carved into sarcophagi, or staged in funerary festivals were not metaphors, they were continuations. The Etruscans envisioned death as an eternal symposium, a perpetual feast shared among family and ancestors. Where Greek afterlives often spoke of shadowy gloom in Hades, the Etruscans painted dining couches, roasted meats, and cups of wine onto tomb walls, declaring that joy did not perish when the body did. The tomb of the leopards at Tarquinia, already encountered earlier, is one of the best illustrations. Couples recline on couches, servants advance with platters, musicians play, an ambiance of festivity suffuses the chamber. The leopards painted above may symbolize a wild vitality, guardians of the revel. Rather than solemnity, the fresco radiates merriment, as if reminding us that to eat, drink, and celebrate was the core of existence, continued seamlessly into eternity. Scholars still debate whether these images were literal depictions of funerary feasts held at burial or idealized visions of an otherworldly banquet. Either way, their message is clear. Death did not end belonging at the table. Even outside art, archaeological traces confirm the centrality of feasting. In tombs, archaeologists have uncovered remains of banqueting vessels, amphorae, and drinking cups deliberately broken for ritual use. Animal bones scattered in burial contexts suggest that full meals were consumed in honor of the deceased, then offered as if to accompany them across the threshold. In some cases, entire banquet sets were included, a statement that the pleasures of life were a sacred birthright to be carried into death. The prominence of women in these depictions, reclining alongside men, underscores once again the unusual equality of Etruscan custom. Quirky Greek commentators were scandalized to learn that Etruscan women dined in public with men, reclining side by side as honored companions. For Romans, this too became a source of moralizing myth, painted as decadence. Yet, within Etruscan context, it seems entirely natural, a projection of family unity into eternity. What scandalized their neighbors may have been, for Etruscans, a deeply intuitive reflection of life's communal fabric. Banquets were not only celebrations, but also moments of sacred mediation. Priests, augurs, and haruspices sometimes presided over funeral games and feasts, ensuring that the deceased entered the afterworld properly provisioned and properly reconciled with the gods. Feasting was cosmic as much as social. Food and drink offered at the table functioned as libations to deities, as well as nourishment for souls. Curiously, these feasts were also linked to spectacle. Athletic contests, gladiatorial preliminaries, and staged entertainments sometimes accompanied funerary banquets, perhaps providing energy or sacrificial strength to the departed spirit. In this way, the Etruscan view of the dead embraced both joy and violence, food and blood, music and struggle, all woven into one tapestry of ritual. Over time, darker tones crept into banquet scenes. Later tombs juxtaposed diners with images of demons and underworld guides, as though the feast stretched on under ominous supervision. The conviviality endured, but shadows lengthened, perhaps a reflection of changing political fortunes as Etruscan independence waned. Still, the central theme held: to die was not to relinquish the banquet, but to relocate it. Today, these feasts depicted on walls and carved into stone draw us into their rhythm. We can look across 2.5 millennia and still sense the clink of cups, the music echoing through vaulted chambers, the smile of a guest raising bread toward our gaze. The banquets of the dead remind us that for the Etruscans, life was not ended by death but extended, and that eternity itself was imagined as one long meal a community carried forward forever. Mask of Death. Amid the feasts and music that adorned their tombs, the Etruscans also pursued another strange and intimate goal: preserving the very faces of the dead. Death was not meant to erase individuality. Instead, it was to be moulded, remembered, and displayed for eternity. Their sarcophagi and funerary urns reveal a deep preoccupation with likeness, identity, and the possibility that memory could survive in clay and stone, even when flesh had gone cold. One of the most extraordinary aspects of this practice lies in their sarcophagi lids. Couples are shown reclining, smiling, and gesturing, their features stylized yet recognizable. Unlike Egyptian mummies, which wrapped identity in ritual abstraction, or Greek grave stelae, which often recorded anonymous forms, the Etruscans insisted upon capturing the face, the joining of lifelike specificity and symbolic artistry. Even urns designed for cremated remains were shaped as little houses or as busts bearing a likeness of the deceased. To meet an Etruscan funerary lid today is to find oneself looked at directly across a chasm of 2,500 years. One striking piece is the sarcophagus of Lathia Scianti, a noblewoman rendered in painted terracotta. Draped in finery, she reclines luxuriously, her eyes and lips marked with the enigmatic Etruscan smile. Beside her, jewelry and gestures speak of wealth and confidence. This is not anonymity in death, it is assertion. Lathia insists that her name, her image, her very personality will endure. Quirky details, like painted eyes or carefully incised hairstyles, remind us how finely identity was preserved, down to ornaments and cosmetics. These practices stand in curious tension with the opacity of Etruscan language. They left behind few decipherable texts, but they left faces full of detail, ensuring recognition even when words failed. It is almost as if they understood that Thames' air language might not survive, but their image could. Scholars still debate whether these likenesses should be read as portraits of individuals or as idealized family stock, but the specificity of detail strongly suggests the intention to convey unique identities rather than generic types. Interestingly, the Romans had an echo of this tradition in their use of death masks, imagines Maiorum, wax impressions of ancestors' faces displayed in family shrines. Many historians believe this practice derived directly from Etruscan influence, a transmission of priority given to personal memory. But where Romans emphasized solemn gravitas, the Etruscans emphasized vitality. Their dead did not gaze sternly. They reclined, smiled, conversed forever at some unseen banquet. Some funerary urns go even further in their strangeness. In Volterra, cinerary urns carved in alabaster show grotesque demons clasping the sides, while lids depict deceased figures in intricate dress. The combination of horror and humanity is striking, the living face juxtaposed with underworld imagery crawling around the vessel. Here art conveys a philosophy, that identity survived but was shadowed by the presence of the beyond. Fragments found across Etruria suggest a sustained effort to honour individuality. Jewellery interred with bodies was not randomly symbolic but personally significant, signalling affection, prestige or attachment. Love and status were given form not only in material markers, but in the very determination to sculpt who the person had been. The memory of personal lives mattered. Thus, in contemplating Etruscan death masks, urns and sarcophagi, we confront the civilization's distinctive balance, the affirmation of community in feasts, and the insistence on individuality through faces. Death was not faceless, but personal. Eternity was not abstract, but filled with recognizable features and gestures. In our museums today, to walk past these terracotta sarcophagi is to encounter their longevity. Their names may be lost to their unintelligible inscriptions, but their eyes still hold us, their smiles still curve in stubborn persistence. The Etruscans may have disappeared as a people, but they denied oblivion to their dead through clay and stone, ensuring that even when Rome tried to bury them, their faces, calm, vivid, unyielding, endured. The Tarquin dynasty, the rise and fall of the Tarquin family, is remembered not only as a political drama but as a battle of memory, where Rome constructed its republic upon the ruins of Etruscan monarchy. At its heart, however, the saga of the Tarquins is a story of one dynasty that bridged two cultures. They were at once rulers of Rome and emissaries of Etruria, carrying their civilization's imprint into the city, only to be immortalized by Rome as villains in its origin tale of freedom. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the dynasty's founder, is remembered for transforming Rome from a cluster of villages into a true city. His projects were nothing short of visionary. The Circus Maximus, where chariot races thundered for centuries, the Cloaca Maxima, taming the wetlands, and the Capitoline Temple, imposing divine grandeur over Rome. Though legend cloaks his reign, archaeology confirms that major civic works align with this period. His Etruscan kingship had reshaped a Latin settlement into urban majesty. Next came Servius Tullius, his rise wrapped in myth. Born, some say, of servile origins, legend recalls that as a child he was mysteriously encircled by a halo of fire while asleep, a sign to Queen Tanaquil, wife of Priscus, that the gods had chosen him. Tanaquil herself, a powerful Etruscan woman, manoeuvred Servius into kingship after Priscus's assassination. Servius reorganized the citizen body, built new walls, and recast Roman politics into censuses and class-divided assemblies. His reforms had long-reaching repercussions, embedding Etruscan conceptions of ritualized order into the city's very governance. Finally rose Tarquinius Superbus, the infamous Tarquin the Proud. His name, legend insists, became synonymous with arrogance and tyranny. Later, Roman historians depicted him as a brute who seized power through murder, ruled through fear, and disdained traditional lay. Under his reign, Rome prospered materially, but groaned under oppression. He secured territory and alliances, but at the cost of popular resentment. The stories of his fall cast him as the ultimate embodiment of despotism, so extreme that Rome swore never again to suffer kings. The turning point came with the outrage of Lucretia, the noblewoman assaulted by the king's son. Her suicide, if we believe Roman tradition, ignited a revolution led by Lucius Junius Brutus, who rallied Romans to expel the Tarquins in 509 BCE. Yet here we must pause, for scholars still debate whether this melodramatic tale was partly Rome's invention, crafted to crown its new republic with a myth of liberation. Was Tarquin Superbus truly such a tyrant, or did Rome exaggerate to justify political transformation? Archaeological traces suggest a less simple story. Prosperity and building continued in his time, hardly signs of a city in collapse. Even after expulsion, the dynasty's shadow loomed. Tarquin sought help from fellow Etruscans to reclaim his throne. His appeal to Lars Porsena of Clusium triggered legendary sieges of Rome. Though later Romans insisted they heroically resisted, some sources hint Porsena may have actually subjugated Rome for a time, though later Roman memory erased this humiliation. Quirky tales like that of Horatius Cocles standing alone on a bridge to hold back Porsena's army crystallize how Rome mythologized its contest with Etruria, transforming possible defeat into moral victory. Thus, the Tarquins represent both the grandeur and the downfall of Etruscan influence in Rome. They gave the city its first great works, infused its politics with ritual structure, and linked it solidly into wider Mediterranean webs of power. Yet Rome remembered them as oppressors, deliberately casting their names into infamy so the Republic could rise in deliberate contrast to their monarchy. Today, standing before the remains of the Cloaca Maxima or the Capitoline Temple, we inhabit a paradox. What survives from this era are monuments of glory built under Etruscan kings, while what survives in narrative is the Roman condemnation of them as tyrants. Between stone and story lies the truth. The Tarquin dynasty was both Rome's architect and Rome's foil, builders of its foundations, yet doomed to be remembered as shadows expelled at dawn. Rise of the Republic. The downfall of the Tarquins did not simply end an era, it lit a torch for Rome's new narrative. In 509 BCE, the Romans declared they would no longer endure kingship, a form forever associated with Etruscan domination. From monarchy's ashes, the Republic was born. But the line between fact and myth is blurred, for what survives is largely Rome's version of events, a retelling chiseled with moral lessons, painting Rome as the defender of liberty and the Etruscans as oppressors. Reality, however, was surely more complex. The Republic's founding tales centre upon Lucius Junius Brutus, the supposed nephew of Tarquin the Proud. Once feigning dullness to avoid suspicion, he became the resolute leader who rallied citizens after the outrage of Lucretia. Oaths were sworn over her blood, pledging eternal hatred of monarchy. It is hard not to read in this story the fingerprints of propaganda, a brutal drama tailored to teach future generations that kingship meant tyranny and freedom was born in defiance. Scholars still debate whether Brutus existed as described or whether his figure was constructed later to give Rome a noble liberator at the dawn of its republic. What seems more certain is that Rome's political system shifted dramatically in form, if not in function. Instead of kings, 2 consuls were elected annually, but the symbols of royal authority remained: the purple robe, the golden throne, even the lictors bearing fasces. Only now these trappings belong to magistrates of the Republic, cloaked in a rhetoric of shared power. Paradoxically, Rome hated monarchy so much it retained its symbols, merely dispersing them. This act of rebranding exemplifies how Rome absorbed Etruscan inheritance while declaring independence from it. The expulsion of Tarquin did not end external threats. The deposed king sought aid from both Etruscan cities and Latin allies, leading to early wars that tested Rome's fragile new order. Battles against Porsena of Clusium, as discussed earlier, became immortalized in legend. Rome later told these stories as proofs of its resilience. Horatius Cocles at the bridge, Mutius Scaevola burning his own hand to show Etruscan enemies Roman courage. Yet the archaeological record suggests Rome was weaker during this period, perhaps even briefly subjugated. If so, Rome's later historians deftly recast humiliation into drama, humiliation into heroism. Meanwhile, the Republic was consolidating from within. The Senate rose as a consular class representing patrician lineages who saw advantage in collective governance. Plebeians, the common citizens, were left to struggle for representation, setting off centuries of conflict of the orders. At every turn, the rejection of kingship was reinforced by collective memory. One name became the eternal curse, Tarquinius, shorthand for despotism. Etruscan monarchy thus lived on not in practice, but in perpetual vilification. Quirky evidence of how deeply this memory penetrated emerges in Roman superstition. No Roman child was named Tarquin after the Republic began, as though the name itself carried contagion. Entire dynasties erased themselves from future nomenclature, such was the intensity of the hatred constructed around monarchy. Yet, paradoxically, Rome still honoured Servius Tullius, a king remembered as just and reformist, suggesting that the memories of Etruscan contributions were flexible, curated for ideological needs. And so the Republic took shape. Not a sudden departure from Etruscan roots, but a carefully staged performance of contrast. Rome did not truly discard Etruscan innovations in infrastructure, religion, or symbolism, but repackaged them under a narrative of liberation. The irony is sharp. The Republic's earliest ceremonies continued to be guide by Etruscan augurs and priests, even as the Republic denounced Etruscan kings for superstition. The rise of the Republic was less a clean break than a rebirth staged in opposition. The Etruscans became Rome's other, the necessary foil against which its freedom could gleam. But beneath that theatrical retelling, the scaffolding of the Republic still clung to its predecessor. This duality defines Rome's beginning as much as any oath of Brutus. To be Roman was, in part, to be Etruscan, but never to admit it too openly. Wars for Veii. If there was one contest that marked Rome's ascendancy over Etruria, it was the long, grinding struggle for Veii. Located only 12 miles north of Rome, Veii was one of the most powerful and prosperous of the Etruscan city-states, its walls stretching for miles, its wealth drawn from both agriculture and trade. For centuries, Veii and Rome watched one another across the Tiber Valley, rivals for territory, resources, and influence. Their proximity made conflict inevitable, and their war became legendary, culminating in a decade-long siege that tested both civilizations. The first clashes began as early as the 5th century BCE. Rome and Veii alternated between hostility and truces, with records of battles interspersed with years of fragile peace. Veii's control of salt routes and fertile lands around the river made it a duel worth contesting. Each side claimed advantage in different moments, but Rome, still a growing power, found in Veii its most dangerous neighbour. Roman legends immortalised these struggles as tales of endurance, a younger city wrestling with an older, mightier rival. The climax came in the early 4th century BCE, with the famed siege of Veii, lasting, tradition tells us, 10 relentless years, an echo perhaps of Homer's Trojan War recast onto Italian soil. The Romans, led by the brilliant commander Marcus Furius Camillus, are said to have dug tunnels beneath the city's walls, using engineering as their weapon where open assault had failed. Through these subterranean passages, Roman soldiers infiltrated Veii, breaking the stalemate and delivering a decisive blow. With Veii's fall around 396 BCE, Rome absorbed not only territory, but also the symbolic prestige of conquering a city whose magnificence rivaled its own. Quirky legends surround this war. Roman tradition insisted that Veii's last king, in a gesture of desperation, begged divine Joidance from Juno, the city's patron goddess. The Romans then performed an evocative ritual. They called Juno to abandon Veii and take up residence in Rome, promising her grander temples and richer honour. According to the myth, she accepted, allowing her statue to smile and nod as she was carried away to the Capitoline. Whether literal or symbolic, the story reveals profound truths about cultural absorption. Rome conquered Veii not only with soldiers, but by adopting its gods and identity into its own. Scholars still debate whether such evocations were real practices or later inventions to sanctify conquest, but the story encodes how deeply Rome tied legitimacy to Etruscan traditions. The fall of Veii was transformative. Rome doubled its territory, gaining not only farmland but Etruscan infrastructure, artisan workshops, and wealth from trade routes. It marked the first time Romans granted citizenship beyond their immediate community, integrating conquered people into their civic body rather than simply subjugating them. Thus, through Veii, Rome learned to expand not as a raider, but as an incorporator, an approach that would define its imperial destiny. For the Etruscan world, however, Veii's loss was catastrophic. A city of immense power, anchor of the southern Etruscan region and unifier of nearby states, was obliterated. Its downfall signalled that the balance had tipped permanently. Rome was no longer a minor neighbour, it was the dominant force, pressing northward inexorably. Yet even here, memory distorts. Archaeology reveals evidence of destruction, but also signs of gradual Roman integration, with some neighbourhoods continuing long after conquest. The stark image of total obliteration may reflect more Roman myth-making than literal fact. Rome fashioning Veii into a new Troy, defeated in order to elevate itself into destiny's chosen heir. The wars with Veii thus crystallise the transformation of central Italy. Here, in battles fought beside salt marshes and across tunnel-dug walls, Etruscan autonomy gave way to Roman ascendancy. Veii fell, and with it fell the illusion that Etruria could hold the future. Rome's expansion was now unstoppable, built upon the ruins of a sister civilization whose gods, architecture and traditions it would carry forward, while erasing their names. The long decline, the fall of Veii was not the end of Etruria, but it was the beginning of the end. After centuries of prominence, the Etruscan city-states entered a slow, uneven decline through the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, culminating in their absorption into Rome's orbit. To trace this decline is to witness the shrinking of a once dazzling constellation, a network of proud, independent cities, reduced, one by one, by pressure from without and weakness from within. The Etruscan Federation had always been a confederation of 12 cities, bound by ritual gatherings at the Fanum Voltumnae. Yet these bonds were weak when tested by war. Unlike Rome, increasingly unified under the Republic's centralized command, the Etruscan alliance fractured. Individual cities often fought alone, with neighbours cautious, hesitant, or preoccupied by their own feuds. When Veii fell, aid from other Etruscan cities proved limited and belated. Without unity, their ability to resist Rome and later other regional powers crumbled. Scholars still debate whether this disunity was the decisive factor in their decline, or whether Rome's sheer adaptability would have overcome even a stronger Etruscan front. Meanwhile, external forces pressed on multiple sides. To the north came Celtic incursions. The Gauls stormed across the Alps, sacking Etruscan towns, and eventually even Rome itself in 390 BCE. To the south, Roman expansion strained borders. To the west, Carthaginian naval might overshadowed Etruscan sea power. Surrounded by these rising powers, Etruria's dominance of land and water ebbed away. Individual cities fell at different paces. Volsinii, once a thriving hub, turned turbulent in the 3rd century BCE, torn apart by internal conflict between its elites and empowered freedmen. Rome intervened, ultimately dismantling the city and resettling survivors into what became Bolsena. Falarii, known Tod, a Aztivita Castellana, was conquered in 241 BCE after rebelling against Rome, its inhabitants forcibly displaced. Tarquinia, Cerveteri and Vulci, once luminous centres, endured repeated Roman campaigns through the 4th and 3rd centuries. By stages, resistance melted into enforced treaties, tributary status, and finally full incorporation. Quirky anecdotes still emerge from this decline. Livy recounts that as Tarquinia's power ebbed, disgruntled Etruscan citizens revived old rituals of human sacrifice, burying alive pairs of Greeks and Gauls, a desperate attempt to appease the gods. Romans, horrified yet fascinated, later copied the practice in times of existential peril. Whether historical or exaggerated, the tale illustrates how Roman memory loved to cloak Etruria's decline in exotic strangeness. Archaeological evidence, however, presents a subtler tale. Even after conquest, Etruscan refinement endured in art, religion, and daily life. Bucero pottery continued to be crafted and used. Local cults remained vibrant. Inscriptions in the Etruscan language persisted well into the 1st century BCE. Rather than sudden erasure, there was a slow assimilation, with traces enduring generations beyond political absorption. Still, the psychological blow was shattering. For a people who had once dominated seas, mined metals for all of Italy, and even ruled Rome itself, to watch their cities lose autonomy must have been devastating. Yet they were not annihilated. Instead, they became woven into Rome's fabric, soldiers in Roman armies, priests supplying mystical expertise to Roman generals, artisans crafting goods in Roman markets. The Etruscans survived, but seldom under their own name. By the mid-3rd century BCE, the map of Italy was clear. Rome's dominion extended north and south, Etruria securely within its grasp. The confederation that had once intimidated neighbours was gone. Its cities retained identity, but their independence was finished. Rome had accomplished what centuries of rivalries could not. It had unmade Etruria. The long decline then should not be understood as collapsing chaos, but as gradual absorption, slow erosion of independence, culture repurposed in Roman moulds, gods renamed and faces recast. It is a quieter end than a catastrophic fall, but no less profound. Etruria's twilight was not sudden nightfall, but a long dusk, fading city by city into the growing glow of Rome, Whispered resistance. Though the Etruscan cities were gradually absorbed into Rome's growing state, their culture did not simply vanish overnight. Beneath the weight of conquest, in villages and countryside shrines, ordinary people clung to fragments of the old ways. It is here, in scattered folklore and whispered traditions, that we glimpse a quieter, more elusive form of resistance, a cultural persistence beyond political defeat. Roman writers sometimes noted with fascination, sometimes with disdain, that Etruscan rituals continued long after their cities had lost autonomy. Priests known as haruspices were still summoned not only by rural families, but by the highest Roman magistrates to interpret omens and livers. Even Julius Caesar consulted such experts centuries later, proof that Etruscan authority endured in spiritual matters. Their wisdom was never forgotten, even if the names of their cities faded from political maps. Scholars still debate whether these surviving haruspices were truly Etruscan descendants or merely Roman-trained interpreters keeping the system alive in name. In rural sanctuaries, humble altars and roadside shrines reveal continuity. Excavations at sites like Bolsena and Tarquinia show evidence of offerings made well into the Roman period, votives shaped like limbs, animals, or miniature tools, reflecting the old traditions of petitioning gods for healing, prosperity, and safe passage. These practices, distinctly Etruscan in origin, continued under the veneer of Roman religion, but retained their characteristic style. Rome may have renamed the deities, but the devotion survived among the people. Quirky traces survive in folklore too. Later, medieval and Renaissance stories from Tuscany speak of buried treasures guarded by spirits, guardians often described in ways uncannily similar to Etruscan underworld demons, legends of hidden tunnels beneath. Volterra, or ghostly banquets in Tarquinia, bear a faint echo of Etruscan afterlife imagery. Of course, determining continuity from antiquity to folklore is uncertain, yet the persistence of these motifs across generations suggests that memory lingered, transformed into local myth even after political markers had been erased. Roman authors also recall more explicit acts of resistance. In the 3rd century BCE, the city of Volsinii was said to have dissolved into internal revolt, with freedmen rising against the nobility. Though Rome exploited this division to impose direct control, the episode speaks to the Etruscan struggle against both external conquest and internal fracture. Resistance was not always organised marches of armies, but also the stubborn continuation of social customs and political quarrels distinctly their own. Even language, though largely supplanted by Latin, did not die immediately. Inscriptions in Etruscan survive into the 1st century BCE, long after their independence had dissolved. Coins at Volterra, gravestones in Perugia, dedications at Clusium, all carry letters in that enigmatic script. To inscribe one's loved one's name in Etruscan, even as Rome's tongue dominated, was a small act of cultural fidelity, a whisper against the pulling tide of assimilation. Scholars still debate whether we should call this persistence resistance. Perhaps it was not organised defiance so much as habit, tradition carried on by families uninterested in political upheaval. Yet in a sense, survival itself is resistance, a culture continuing in fragments, invisible yet indelible. Rome did not succeed in erasing every thread. Instead, the Etruscans lived on in quiet practices, in rituals lowly and grand, in names engraved onto urns, in omens read on battlefields. Thus, if we listen closely, the Etruscans never vanished all at once. They remained alive in hillsides, in rural sanctuaries, in the memories of rituals Romans still relied on. Like a half-forgotten song whose melody emerges faintly at odd intervals, their legacy whispered across centuries, surviving quietly under Rome's dominion. Language without airs. Perhaps the most haunting silence left by the Etruscans is their language. Unlike Greek, which seeded philosophy and literature across the Mediterranean, or Latin, which became the basis of Europe's Romance tongues, Etruscan died with its people, leaving only fragments behind. We can read its letters, for they borrowed their script from the Greeks, but we cannot fully understand its words. Of all their legacies, none underscores their disappearance more profoundly than the fact that their voice itself has no heirs. Over 10,000 Etruscan inscriptions survive, scratched into pottery, carved on tomb walls, etched into votive offerings, or engraved on bronze mirrors. Most are brief: names, dedications, funerary markers. Simple phrases like son of or offering to appear often, clear in context but mute beyond it. Longer texts exist, but they are rare and frustratingly obscure. The most famous is the Liber Linteus, the linen book repurposed as wrappings for an Egyptian mummy, which preserves over 1,000 Etruscan words in flowing script. Yet scholars have only managed partial translations, suggesting it relates to ritual calendars and offerings. Without bilingual keys, like the Rosetta Stone provided for Egyptian hieroglyphs, meaning continues to elude us, scholars still debate whether the language was a true isolate or belonged to a forgotten family of Mediterranean or Alpine tongues. The structure that can be deciphered seems unrelated to Indo-European languages surrounding it. Certain words, however, have left echoes. Fursu, for instance, meaning mask, was adopted into Latin as persona, giving rise eventually to the English person. A quirky survival, trivial though it may seem, shows how something as ephemeral as a theatrical mask carried their language forward invisibly into modern identity. Another survival might be atria, referi, nang to central halls of houses, also absorbed by Romans. These ghost words are like splinters from a vanished forest, tiny fragments reminding us of a once lush soundscape. Some inscriptions are tantalizing in their poignancy. A bronze mirror bears the engraved figures of gods with labelled names. A stone epitaph declares lineage through both father and mother, hinting at a society determined to remember ancestry. Others appear on jewellery, perhaps inscribed as protective charms, their meanings lost, but their purpose clear, an intimate link between wearer and divine. Yet for every word we glimpse, thousands stare back in silence. Linguists continue to struggle with syntax, tenses, and even basic vocabulary. Each discovery raises more questions than answers. Was their language linked to ancient Anatolian dialects, vindicating Herodotus's claim of eastern migration? Or was it truly native to Italy, an autochthonous tongue born of forgotten prehistory? The shards refuse to settle into one coherent story. Archaeological finds amplify this enigma. Inscriptions appear on dice, on weights, even on roof tiles, suggesting their language saturated daily life. But without the ability to read these texts fully, what survives is like hearing echoes without the voice that made them. Etruria remains present, yet unreachable. The Romans themselves seemed unable or unwilling to preserve it. Even when they inherited Etruscan rituals wholesale, they recited prayers without full comprehension of the original words. Now and then, Roman authors admitted the antiquity of these phrases, confessing they were repeating syllables whose meaning had faded. This partial ignorance suggests the Romans turned Etruscan language into liturgical fossil, repeated faithfully, understood dimly. And so the Etruscan language stands today as one of history's unresolved riddles. It endures in inscriptions shining faintly in museums, in scattered artifacts, in tantalizing words that pass anonymously into later tongues. But no literature, no epic, no mythology survives in their own words. Their voices, once loud across Italy, now arrive to us as faint whispers, transcribed but untranslatable. Like the people themselves, vanquished and absorbed, their language lingers in fragments without heirs, a reminder that civilizations can be remembered in stone yet silenced in speech. The bronze liver, Among the many odd relics left by the Etruscans, none embodies their obsession with the divine language of signs more vividly than the liver of Piacenza. Discovered in northern Italy in 1877, this small bronze model of a sheep's liver is carved into 40 sections, each inscribed with names of deities. To the casual viewer, it appears strange, an anatomical organ immortalized in metal, and yet within it lies the key to Etruscan divination. For their priests, the liver was not merely a biological object. It was the cosmos itself, a map of the universe, where the gods inscribed their will in the tissues of sacrificed animals. Imagine the scene. An Etruscan haruspex, a priest diviner, bows over the still warm body of a sheep, carefully lifting its liver before a waiting crowd or ruler. Every line on the organ, every discoloration, was weighed against codified traditions preserved in priestly memory. Were the gods favourable? Which deity had spoken? From which cosmic quadrant had the message emerged? The bronze liver, with its 16 outer regions and inner divisions, demonstrates how systematic this process was. It transforms what seems chance, a blemish on an organ, into divine speech. Scholars still debate whether the liver of Piacenza was a teaching tool for novice priests or an active ritual instrument. Either way, its preservation shows how central divination was to Etruscan life. The gods inscribed on the liver's surface reflect their pantheon's complexity. Tinia, the thunder god, appears in one section, Uni in another, Minerva in yet another. Surrounding them were deities unknown to us today, forgotten divine powers whose names survive only because they were carved into bronze. Through this object alone, entire vanished worlds of worship flicker briefly back into our view. Quirky details deepen the enigma. The Etruscans divided the heavens into 16 regi, ons, far more than the quadrants used by Romans or Greeks. Each portion of the sky corresponded to zones on the sheep's liver. Thus, as lightning cracked across the heavens, or birds wheeled above, priests could cross-reference what they saw in nature with what they read in entrails, joining sky and flesh into a single, coherent message. It was a worldview where correspondence bound all things together. Heaven reflected earth, organ-mapped cosmos. The Romans, fascinated yet uneasy, adopted these practices wholesale. By the late Republic and early Empire, haruspices were still consulted in moments of crisis. Even emperors like Augustus and Claudius are said to have valued Etruscan expertise. Cicero himself, writing on divination, acknowledged the profound role of Etruscan wisdom in shaping Rome's religious life, though he raised skeptical questions. Was every thunderbolt really a message? Were the gods truly scribing across sheep livers? Scholars still debate whether this practice was sincerely believed by all or functioned partly as political theatre, tools of legitimacy dressed in divine sanction. Archaeology confirms its ritual weight. Representations of livers appear on engraved bronzes, and models of entrails have been found across central Italy. It was not an isolated eccentricity, but a widespread practice. The bronze lever of Piacenza simply stands as the most eloquent example, a teaching board, perhaps, for generations of initiates who memorized where each god ruled. The object's survival is in itself remarkable. Buried for centuries, it resurfaced by chance, one of the few tangible keys to a lost sacred system. Without it, we might underestimate the depth and complexity of Etruscan divination. With it, we sense how obsessively they sought order in the world, believing that every natural detail contained divine expression. And so, the bronze liver embodies both the brilliance and the mystery of Etruria. It speaks of an entire science of the sacred, precise, intricate, thorough, yet also of a worldview alien to us, where sheep entrails guided armies, senates, and kings. In the glow of museum lights, it gleams as more than a curious artifact. It is a fragment of a vanished cosmos, a reminder that the Etruscans read the world in symbols we can no longer fully decipher, banished gods. As Rome expanded across Etruria, it did not only conquer cities and armies, it absorbed and altered the pantheon itself. Many of the great Roman gods so familiar to us today wore Etruscan clothing in their earliest forms. Yet as centuries passed, these deities were repackaged, renamed, and ultimately claimed as Roman. The Etruscan divine world was not destroyed outright, but banished into shadows, surviving only in the faint outlines of Roman Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. Take Tinia, the Etruscan sky god, wielder of thunderbolts, supreme over heaven's 16 regions. His name faded, but his thunder strikes live on in the Roman Jupiter Optimus Maximus. No coincidence, as Rome's most glorious temple on the Capitoline Hill had its original foundations laid under Tarquin rule. Uni, consort of Tinia, became the Roman Juno, guardian of the state and embodiment of feminine power. Minerva, goddess of wisdom, music, and war, metamorphosed into Minerva, eventually fused with Athena's Greek persona. These transitions demonstrate not a simple borrowing, but a process of cultural rewrite. The Etruscan names were discarded, their functions retained, until Rome had absorbed the essence, but erased the source. Scholars still debate whether this was accidental cultural drift or a deliberate stripping away of Etruscan identity. Other figures were stranger and less easily assimilated. Charon, the hammer-wielding conductor of souls, and Vanth, the winged spirit who guided the dead, appear frequently in tomb art. Their fearsome visages, eyes bulging, teeth bared, paint a far darker underworld than the Greeks' shadowy Hades, or Rome's eventual vision of orderly afterlife realms. These deities were not invited into Rome's pantheon in full. Instead, their attributes seem to dissolve, portioned out into later conceptions of demons, furies, and death spirits. It is as though Rome's cell acted what was useful and discarded what felt too alien or menacing. Quirky survivals do linger. The Roman practice of evocatio, calling upon the patron gods of enemy cities to abandon their homes and accept better worship in Rome, reflects distinctly Etruscan precedents. At Veii, as we saw earlier, Romans claimed to invite Juno to leave her city and settle on the Capitoline, symbolically legitimizing conquest through divine cooperation. This blending of warfare and religion is deeply Etruscan in character, though Rome immortalized it as its own ritualistic piety. In domestic cults too, the Etruscan influence persisted. Household altars, protective spirits, and practices like sacrificing at doorways or crossroads bore echoes of Etruscan rites. Romans eventually attributed these to their own lares and penates, but the underlying structure likely had Etruscan roots. Even the Roman Senate's reliance on augury and haruspices testifies to this continuity. For centuries after Etruria's conquest, no major Roman state decision was finalized without consulting omens drawn from Etruscan methods. The gods spoken to were Roman by name, but Etruscan in lineage. And yet, when memory was retold, the Etruscan identity of these gods faded. Roman writers wrote of Jupiter, Juno, and Mars, attributing their institutions to heroic ancestors or Trojan refugees. Etruria, which had nurtured these divine languages, was seldom credited, its gods banished behind Roman masks. Scholars still debate how much of Roman religion is truly Roman and how much is Etruscan inheritance, but the pattern of erasure is undeniable. Standing before Etruscan tomb paintings of death demons or terracotta statues of vibrant deities, we see beings that Rome never allowed into its mainstream pantheon fully. They were too wild, too uncanny, too rooted in a worldview that Rome chose to file away as superstition rather than honour. The gods were banished in name, but fragments stayed embedded in ritual. Thus, the Etruscan pantheon lives on invisibly in the Roman one, and through Rome into the Western tradition. Tinia survives in Jupiter's thunder, Uni in Juno's majesty, Minerva in Minerva's wisdom. The others, the darker deities, whisper only in shadows. Banished, unnamed, yet never truly gone, they form the most haunting reminder that behind Rome's divine order was another world, a pantheon carefully stitched over, its names erased, but its spirit unkillable. Buried treasures. Even as Etruscan cities fell and their gods were renamed, much of their world remained hidden underground, buried by time, conquest, and deliberate forgetting. It is only through accidental discoveries, plundered tombs, excavated necropolises, and chance finds in fields, that their material legacy reawakens. These buried treasures, glittering with artistry and craftsmanship, give us our most intimate glimpse into a civilization Rome tried so hard to erase. At Cerveteri and Tarquinia, entire necropolises have yielded exquisite artifacts, fine Bucero pottery, bronze utensils, and vibrant frescoes. But among the most stunning finds are their golden ornaments. The Etruscans mastered techniques like filigree and granulation, creating jewellery so intricate that even modern goldsmiths struggle to replicate it precisely. Tiny spheres of gold, impossibly small, form delicate patterns on earrings, necklaces, and brooches. The artistry speaks not only of wealth, but of a symbolic importance, jewels meant to illuminate the status of the deceased in both worlds. Perhaps the most famous discovery came in the 19th century, when archaeologists uncovered exquisitely decorated painted tombs in Tarquinia. There, frescoes of dancers and musicians, banquets and wrestling matches startled the modern world with their colour and vitality. Romans had described the Etruscans as decadent, pleasure-loving, even immoral, but these paintings told a subtler story, a society equally preoccupied with joy and ritual. The frescoes, hidden for millennia, became the truest Etruscan voice once their language was lost. Scholars still debate whether they represent literal moments or symbolic journeys of the spirit. Quirky treasures emerged too. Bronze mirrors inscribed with mythological scenes were often buried with women, showing not only their daily utility, but also their spiritual resonance. Some depict Greek myths in Etruscan reinterpretations. Perseus, Heracles, Helen, inscribed with names written in a script now unreadable. One mirror even shows the judgment of Paris, a tale central to Greek identity, but inscribed with distinctively Etruscan labels, blending two worlds into a single artifact. Other finds reveal global connections. Imported Greek pottery fills Etruscan graves, often mixed with local handiwork. Phoenician beads, Egyptian scarabs, and Eastern goods show the extent of their trade and cosmopolitan tastes. The tomb of the Regalini Galassi at Cerveteri, discovered in 1836, astonished with its wealth. Massive gold pectorals, silver vessels, ivory, and bronze couches. This burial, dated to the 7th century BCE, confirmed that Etruria stood not as a provincial outpost, but as a vibrant node in the luxury networks of the ancient world. Sometimes treasures are not glittering, but humble. Carved urns, inscribed dedications, or even everyday objects like dice and board games tell us as much as golden necklaces. They remind us that Etruscan life was not reserved for elites, but lived richly in domestic routines, play, and craft. A simple ceramic or worn spindle whirl found in a rural tomb whispers more quietly of the people who shaped this culture from below. Yet modern knowledge of these treasures carries shadows. Looting, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries, stripped many tombs of artifacts without preserving context. Priceless vases, jewels, and bronzes were scattered into private collections or museums abroad, severed from the stories that might have deepened our understanding. For every carefully excavated treasure, countless others are lost to history. Still, what remains is enough to dazzle us. The Etruscans may have been politically erased, but their buried treasures resisted oblivion. When unearthed, they astonished modern eyes not only with beauty but with complexity, challenging stereotypes handed down by Roman writers. They force us to rethink. These were not decadent hedonists, but sophisticated artisans, traders, and thinkers. Today, their treasures sit in glass cases in Florence, Rome, London, and museums worldwide. Each bracelet, each painted shard, each bronze mirror is a message from beneath the soil, testifying that this lost civilization did not vanish entirely. Its voice speaks still, not in words, but in gold, colour, and clay, refusing to be wholly erased. The smile endures. Among the thousands of objects and images the Etruscans left behind, one motif refuses to fade, that enigmatic, almost haunting expression carved and moulded into their figures, the Etruscan smile. We encountered it earlier on sarcophagi and terracottas, but its persistence across centuries of their art is striking. It lingers on the faces of the dead, the visages of gods, and the masks of performers. More than an artistic convention, it seems to embody an outlook on existence, a worldview carried in curves of the mouth. It is in many ways their most enduring treasure. Consider the sarcophagus of the spouses from Cerveteri. Husband and wife recline together on banquet couches, smiling at each other and the world, united in eternity. Their hands gesture as though mid-conversation, frozen in dialogue yet ever living. To us, it may seem stylized. To them, it was immortality carved into warmth. Centuries later, in the Roman Republic and Empire, funerary statuary turned toward severity and realism. Faces hardened, wrinkles carved deep, eyes staring with gravitas. But the Etruscan faces remained smiling, as though they knew something their neighbours forgot, that life's vitality surpasses death's silence. The smile also adorns terracotta temple statues, like the vibrant Apollo of Veii. Striding forward energetically, he carries the same upward-turned lips, dynamic and alive. Even deities appeared approachable, suffused with vitality rather than aloof awe. Similarly, smaller bronzes, musicians, dancers, even mythological creatures, carry the same expression, always the curve of lips, the serenity of presence, the suggestion of soul shining through. Scholars still debate whether this smile had symbolic meaning, perhaps tied to conceptions of afterlife joy, or whether it was simply an aesthetic style. But its ubiquity demands we take it seriously as an emblem of worldview. Quirky finds reinforce this vitality. Painted dancers in Tarquinia's tombs, even as they accompany funerals, appear mid-leap, carefree, eyes lively, mouths curved in cheer. Mirrors engraved with mythological scenes often show figures not solemn but gently smiling, gods and mortals alike caught in perpetual play. Whether in bronze, terracotta, or paint, the smile persists, less grim reminder of mortality, more celebration of secured continuity. Roman authors, puzzled by this, sometimes accused the Etruscans of indulgence, interpreting their imagery of joy as proof of decadence. But this says more about Roman austerity than Etruscan excess. Where Rome defined itself by severity, Etruria embraced a worldview in which life and afterlife were porous, linked realms of warmth. The Etruscan smile was not frivolity, but defiance, a reminder that death's finality could be resisted through enduring vitality. What is most remarkable is how strongly this expression resonates even now. Walk into the Villa Giulia Museum in Rome or the Louvre in Paris, and those same terracotta faces reach across millennia, smiling with eyes that still meet ours. The power is immediate, intimate, irrefutable. There are few ancient civilizations that appear to us, not in fresco fragments or inscriptions, but as people, recognizable, warm, human. This is the gift of the Etruscans, individuality rendered eternal, vitality preserved in clay. Their smile endures also as a metaphor. Though their language is mute and their cities absorbed, their worldview survives not in texts, but in expressions that transcend translation. It is as though they left us a knowing look, a quiet reassurance that they were here, that their lives were vivid, and that erasure was never complete. Today, when we look upon that expression, we are reminded that while Rome became empire, law, and power, the Etruscans chose to be remembered for closeness, festivity, and warmth. The smile endures not just on their artifacts, but as the essence of their memory. Behind the silence of a vanished tongue, behind conquest and assimilation, their humanity persists, in a smile that has lasted 2,500 years. DNA echoes. For centuries, the origins of the Etruscans were wrapped in speculation. Were they migrants from distant Anatolia, as Herodotus believed, natives of Italy itself, as Dionysius of Halicarnassus argued, or a people from the distant north, filtering into Tuscany over alpine passes? Ancient authors debated it passionately, and modern science has entered the conversation with its own tools. Through genetic evidence, the mystery has been reopened, not solved but reframed with new evidence and new puzzles. In recent decades, researchers have extracted DNA from Etruscan skeletal remains, comparing them with ancient and modern populations. The results are intriguing but not definitive. Some studies suggest affinities with populations in Anatolia, lending support to Herodotus's story of Lydian migrants who sailed westward to Italy during famine. Other analyses emphasize close ties to Italic neighbors, showing genetic continuity between Etruscans and earlier Villanovan peoples of the Italian peninsula. Still others trace links northward toward Alpine groups, hinting at population movements more complex than a single origin myth could capture. Scholars still debate whether the DNA reveals migration, long-term continuity, or a blend of both, an argument as unresolved today as it was in antiquity. One quirky twist lies in the comparison to modern Tuscan populations. Certain regional genetic markers persist today, especially in areas once occupied by Etruscans. This has led some geneticists to argue that present-day Tuscans preserve echoes of the Etruscan genome, even if the culture itself vanished. Tuscany, the very land that still carries the echo of their name, may harbour biological continuity invisible in cultural history. A 2013 study even suggested that DNA from populations along the Tyrrhenian coast showed closer ties to Anatolia than inland Italians did, as though coastal communities preserved genetic memory of ancient seafarers. Of course, interpreting genetic data is not simple. Ancient samples are often degraded, leaving room for statistical ambiguity. Migration across the Mediterranean was constant, complicating attempts to distinguish Etruscan from broader Mediterranean patterns. Thus, scientists and historians alike tread carefully, unwilling to proclaim certainty where results remain partial. Yet even this uncertainty offers insight. It reveals that the story of the Etruscans is not a clean line from one origin to another, but a web of connections spanning seas and centuries. What genetic studies remind us above all is that identity is not reducible to origins. For the Etruscans, what mattered was not where they came from, but how they defined themselves, calling themselves Rasenna, shaping cities of stone, painting tomb walls, and smiling from clay sarcophagi. Origins mattered less to them than to later outsiders. Yet the persistence of the debate, from Herodotus to our own laboratories, underscores how seductive the question remains. From where did these enigmatic people emerge? Curiously, genetic echoes also reflect their cultural openness. The Etruscans lived at crossroads of trade, absorbing influences from Greece, Phoenicia, and beyond. It is logical, then, that their DNA might show cosmopolitan complexity rather than homogeneity. Their very identity may have been rooted in blending, in adaptation, in being both local and Mediterranean. Scholars still debate whether this hybridity was their strength, or the reason their culture dissolved more easily into Rome's expanding orbit. Today, when we walk through Tuscany past the vineyards and hill towns draped across landscapes once dominated by Etruscan cities, we cannot help but wonder, are their descendants still here, their genetic legacy hidden beneath Roman surnames and Italian dialects? Perhaps the smile carved in terracotta is mirrored faintly in the DNA of the living, subtle proof that the past never fully disappears. The DNA echoes offer tantalizing answers but no final closure. Instead, they affirm what the Etruscans themselves seem to embody, that identity is both rooted and unbounded, both local and far-reaching, stitched together by trade winds, marriages, migrations, and rituals. Their mystery endures not because it resists science, but because it invites us to see them as more than one origin, more than one story, at once Italian, Mediterranean, and universal. The mystery persists. After centuries of excavation, research, and debate, the Etruscans remain unresolved. Their cities lie in ruins, their language resists decipherment, their gods survive only through Roman masks, and yet their presence refuses to vanish. Each discovery clarifies and complicates at once. We know their engineering shaped Rome, their rituals infused an empire, and their art vibrates with vitality even today, but the core of their identity remains elusive. Were they migrants or natives, tyrants or visionaries, a distinct civilization, or simply the soil out of which Rome sprang? Scholars still debate whether we are seeing the Etruscans directly, or only Rome's distorted reflection of them. The difficulty lies in the nature of their survival. Almost all our written testimony comes from outsiders, Greeks portraying them as decadent pirates, Romans vilifying them as oppressive monarchs. The Etruscans themselves left no literature that we can fully understand. The fragments we decipher, short dedications, names on urns, words etched into bronze, give us intimacy without context. We know their smiles, but not their stories. It is as though we stand before a vast mosaic from which half the tiles have been torn away. Quirky contradictions abound. Roman accounts emphasize Etruscan cruelty, yet their tombs depict joy and music. Greeks describe them as pirates, yet archaeological evidence testifies primarily to brisk trade and cultural exchange. Romans cursed their kings as tyrants, yet kept their regalia, their rituals, even their sacrificial systems. The Etruscans' reality is tangled with misrepresentation, both slandered and secretly honoured by those who absorbed them. Modern archaeology has tried to peel back these layers. Cities like Tarquinia and Cerveteri yield painted tombs that speak more of festivity and community than cruelty. The liver of Piacenza house systematic theology, not superstition. Jewellery and bronzes reveal mastery and elegance, not barbarism. Yet even as evidence mounts, gaps remain. Without their direct voice, we hover in the twilight between clarity and guesswork. And this is, perhaps, why the Etruscans continue to fascinate us. Rome, the empire that swallowed them whole, is abundantly visible in marble, inscription, and Latin text. Greece, too, lives on in epic poetry and philosophy. The Etruscans, by contrast, emerge only in fragments, half erased, like shadows under brighter suns. They are the civilization we strain to hear, their ghosts humming beneath Rome's foundations. The scholars' debates mirror this mystery even today. Some insist we overstate their otherness, that they were simply one Italic people among many, later romanticized for being conquered. Others maintain that their uniqueness, an isolated language, unparalleled tomb art, religious systems unlike their neighbours, marks them as a true, lost civilization. Which is true, perhaps both. They were Italians and yet not, familiar and yet foreign, at once ancestors to Rome and strangers kept at arm's length. This duality keeps them alive in our imagination. They are the civilization Rome tried to erase, yet Rome's greatness is layered upon their foundations. The irony is profound. By conquering them, Rome ensured that their memory would live on forever, if only as a riddle. When we speak of Rome's glory, we unwittingly speak of Etruria too. So the mystery persists, not because we lack evidence, but because the Etruscans left themselves deliberately veiled. Their faces survive, but their voices remain silent. Their images smile at us across museums and necropolises, but their words withhold their meaning. Their ghosts remain rooted in Tuscany's soil, whispering through ruins and treasure alike. And perhaps that is the truest legacy, not to be fully known, but to haunt history's edges, forcing us to remember that beneath Rome's marble lies a far older civilization, hidden, persistent, unforgotten. Twilight of Etruria. By the time Rome rose invincible in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, the Etruscans had all but disappeared as a political force. Their cities still bustled, their artisans still worked, their rituals still whispered into Roman ears, but their independence was gone. What once had been a federation of proud, fortified city-states was now a subdued patchwork swallowed whole by Rome's expanding reach. Their twilight was not a sudden extinction, but a dimming over generations, each decade dissolving a little more of their autonomy. Roman conquest was piecemeal. Treaties imposed here, citizenship extended there, resistance crushed brutally when it flared. Volsini's revolt ended with its destruction. Falerii was dismantled. Tarquinia and Volci suffered repeated defeats before being fully absorbed. By the 2nd century BCE, the last flickers of Etruscan resistance sputtered out, and their cities were woven seamlessly into Rome's state network. Unlike Carthage, they were not annihilated in fire and salt, but consumed gradually, their uniqueness dispersed within the juggernaut of Roman identity. And yet, the twilight of Etruria is not pure erasure. Archaeological and textual evidence alike show that Etruscan traditions lived on. Priests trained in haruspicy still advised Roman leaders long into the empire. The Senate regularly consulted omens in the Etruscan style. Domestic cults preserved traces of their gods under Roman names. Even aspects of gladiatorial spectacle, triumphal symbols, and urban planning bore their fingerprints. Rome's most austere traditions were clothed in Etruscan inheritance, even as Rome pretended otherwise. Quirky survivals remind us of deeper persistence. Inscriptions in Etruscan letters continued to appear into the 1st century BCE, long after Latin dominated. Small sanctuaries retained local rituals, their votive offerings still shape in distinct styles. Regional dialects may have carried echoes of the lost tongue for centuries. Even today, Tuscan folklore contains shadows, legends of subterranean feasts, guardians of tombs, or faceless spirits watching roads that bear uncanny resemblance to Etruscan underworld imagery. Were these faint survivals of ancestral memory, or reinventions, later projections upon ruins that still haunted the countryside? Scholars still debate. The greatest irony of Etruria's twilight is that it was both obliteration and immortality. As a people, they were politically erased. As a language, they were silenced. Yet their infrastructure, their gods, their artistry, their very conception of life's continuity passed into Rome and, through Rome, into the foundations of Europe. The Colosseum echoes their funerary games. Roman temples echo their terracotta gods. Modern words echo their lost tongue. Their twilight was not darkness, but transference, a light dimmed in one world to burn in another. Standing today in Tarquinia's painted tombs or before the bronze chimera of Arezzo, we glimpse this paradox. Their faces still smile, Their artistry still speaks, their mystery remains unsolved. The twilight of Etruria is not the silence of death, but the lingering afterglow of a civilization Rome absorbed but could not fully extinguish. Thus ends their story, not as collapse, but as transformation. The Etruscans live on, not as a nation, but as a presence. Rome wore their regalia, celebrated their pomp, and prayed their prayers while pretending they were its own. In that twilight, the Etruscans achieved their strangest victory. Though absorbed, they became eternal, hidden inside Rome's identity forever. Conclusion. The exploration of the Etruscans, their culture, origins, language, art, religion, and influence on Rome has been comprehensively covered over the previous sections. The story of the Etruscans, from their enigmatic beginnings and rich artistic and ritual life, through their intimate connection to early Rome, their gradual decline, and enduring legacies, is addressed thoroughly. Further continuation would likely be repetitive or speculative, beyond existing archaeological and historical knowledge. If there is a specific aspect or more focused question about the Etruscans or related topics, please specify for targeted elaboration